Squats, sound systems, police roadblocks, one wild party that rewrote the law. Discover how 1980s and 90s free party traveller culture fused with city kids chasing raves in the countryside. On this episode of Tales from a Disappearing City, we talk to filmmaker Aaron Trinder about documenting the era's free party scene and his own countercultural journey. Hear tales of acid trips at Glastonbury, Spiral Tribe's New Year's Eve takeover of the Roundhouse, and the legendary 1992 illegal rave at Castlemorton, the event that changed UK dance music forever. Tales from a Disappearing City. I've got Aaron Trinder with me today.
Hello, nice to be here.
Yeah, no, good to see you, Aaron. I think we met a couple of years ago. Do you remember where we met? I think we met down a record store down in South London.
Yeah, we were trying to think about when it was. I think it was somewhere Norwood or Crystal Palace way. And I was doing a little bit of filming for a project which hasn't quite come to fruition yet. And there was quite a few interesting musical people there, wasn't there? There was Alex Patterson and Darren Emerson.
My friend Davey got me. I was like, I'll come down. It's like Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah.
Play some tunes in this record bar, and then I went down there. So I met you. Alex from the Orb was there.
That's right.
Youth was there.
Yeah.
Darren Emerson walked in.
Yeah.
And it was just this random, and that was about it in this empty record shop. And I was playing some tunes, streaming them over the internet.
Yeah, I think it was all part of there was like a radio stream in some way. And it was just at that point where certain things were allowed again. So, we could kind of go to the record shop. But then the socialising basically ended up being in the kind of yard at the back by the bins. Yeah. But everyone was so kind of grateful for it because it was like, getting to hang out and chat and meet people again for a first time.
Well, I remember it was quite a random thing. I remember I was playing some tunes. I said it was in the shop. I think you lot were out in the back, so I was more or less just playing into an empty shop.
Yeah.
And I think Darren Emerson walked in, and then I was playing some, I don't know, dub of some tune, some old rave tune I've made. He's like, what's this tune? And, blah, blah, blah. And this is pretty random for a Tuesday afternoon. And...
Yeah, people were just so sort of happy to have a little bit of socialising and hanging out with people that they didn't maybe know and music people and everything. So, that was definitely the first time I think we met. And we bumped into each other quite a few times, I think, since, haven't we? At various events.
Can't get rid of you now.
You're stalking me. That's my tale anyway.
No, well, that's true. But obviously, you were filming down there, and then obviously that we were talking that you were at that point you were getting together the film. That we're going into a bit more detail later on. Yeah. But just to say at the start, obviously, you've done a film about the free party scene.
Yes, indeed, called Free Party: A Folk History. So just a potted overview. I guess it's really focused on the sort of origins of it as an idea. So that meeting point between the travelling scene and the rave scene, combining that free festival concept with the acid house music and people who were into it. So it's been a very long journey to get where we are now. We're kind of at the point of sharing. We've done 18 months of film festivals and. But I'm sure we'll get onto all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I know exactly. You've still got the next little step to go. I know that, and
always another little step.
We'll dig into that, but I guess I always like to start because obviously you've got to. Always like to dig into, I guess, people's where they grew up and the sort of history. So where did you grow up there, and what was your sort of background?
Yeah, so born in 1971, West London. My mum was a bit of a hippie, part of the kind of counterculture, I suppose, of the late 60s, early 70s. Went through her mod phase, left home really young, my mum, and she left Coventry, which is where my grandparents were from. My grandma is Welsh, but Dad from the West Country, in Coventry. They met in Coventry. And then my mum must have left when she was 15 and moved to Brighton to be a chambermaid in the mid-60s.
Wow, that sounds
When you say that, that
Yeah.
sounds like Victorian.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure does that still exist? Being a chambermaid, I guess it does in certain.
I guess they probably got a different name now. A chambermaid comes with a bunch of baggage, doesn't it now?
Yeah.
Basically left to work in a hotel.
Yeah, sure.
At the age of 15 or 16, she had a beehive. Had the whole mod thing. 1965, sometime around then. Moved to Brighton, and then she moved to London. Kind of the hair grew out. Kind of joined the whole counterculture 60s thing, I guess 67, 68.
Do you know why she switched from a mod to a hippie, or is it just like
I think that's what everyone did, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, weed came, or grass came in, or whatever it was, and LSD, and the music changed. The Beatles grew their hair, so everybody else grew their hair. It went from the kind of bowl cut and the sharp suits. Yeah. And my mum used to talk about going to Carnaby Street and all that kind of thing to get her clothes, and loved her clothes, and was sort of into, the music scene. She was never a musician, but she was really into music and followed bands around. And even when she was in Coventry, when she was quite young, she was going out with her aunties, drinking frothy coffee at the kind of coffee shops, and
you know what? Yeah, my mum used to talk about that in Soho.
Soho,
yeah. I mean, my mum went, obviously was back. She go back to the 50s, but again, it was the frothy coffee.
Coffee was.
That's what they used to call it.
Yeah. So it was, at that time, it was very exotic to go and get an Italian coffee in a place that had a machine.
Well, I think they had the machines that made loads of noise. I'm not sure how good the coffee was. I think it was literally just blowing a loads of froth on top of a coffee, but still, it looked cool. And
and up till that point, I guess they'd have had the equivalent of Nescafe. That would be all coffee was, So she went through, I suppose, that kind of 60s moment, and then had me 1971. My father, who was a sort of, from Canada and a sort of travelling hippie, they got together, I guess, late 69, early 70, in the kind of peak kind of West London kind of counterculture scene, and then they went travelling together and kind of split up, partly because my father was on a bit of a spiritual mission, wanted to go to India and do the hippie trail.
Yeah.
And my mum wasn't feeling so right. And so she made her way back from Europe, and I think they were in Yugoslavia at the time, got back to London and discovered she was pregnant. Wow. And by that time, my father was on horseback heading across Afghanistan on the hippie trail.
Okay, that sounds very supportive and very old-fashioned.
It was a different era, and I think by the time that was it. That's where his head was. So he was heading that way. So my mum kind of brought me up entirely as a single parent, and although I say that, it was because of the sort of community that I was in, that I was brought up in. It was very much a kind of what used to be squats, I suppose. And we started, I think the first house we lived in was in Powis Square, in a very sort of famous part of West London, which back then was very West Indian, but also where all the hippies were, because they were cheap and there were squats.
Well, one of my favourite films from that era is obviously Performance, which is obviously, that I know it's
film.
not shot inside Powis Square. The flat is apparently somewhere else, but the exterior. Because I used to live in Westbourne Park at the end of the 80s. And I used to walk past there every morning going to, and there's the external shots and the 69 Performance, is it? Something like that,
I mean, one of my favourite films as well, completely, sort of clues into so much of the sort of mythos of where I was born into, in some way.
I mean, he just captures, Mick Jagger's good in it as well.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
You can't say that all the time.
Oh, well, exactly. Rock star, being an actor, he's actually really good in it. I mean, he kind of plays a
version of himself.
A version of himself that maybe.
With
and obviously, is it
James?
Is it James Fox?
James Fox, Anita Pallenberg. It's a great but fabulous film, And that actually, when I was at the carnival the last summer, I've never known which building it was, and I was with Andrew, my collaborator now, on he helped on the film in terms of editing, and he was one of the people with the camera back in the day. And we're now making another film together called Dirty Squatters, bit of a plug. Yeah. He showed me the house because he was a massive Performance fan. He said, "Oh, that's the house." I was like,
it's the one on the corner. It's the one on the corner.
Right on the corner,
Yeah.
So we basically, for a bit that I don't remember, we lived somewhere on Powis Square, and there's pictures of my mum kind of pregnant with me, literally on the corner of Powis Square. And then the bit that I do remember, we moved to Kilburn, and Kilburn was, in a way, is a really interesting area because the little street that we lived on, called Kingsgate Road, had been hit by a bomb, and there was the side of the street that was intact were all council houses and council flats. The other side was literally a bomb site. There was a hole in the road, and then we were on the little run of maybe 20 houses in the basement, and all of those places were squats because they were originally condemned, and then they got turned into and bought up by housing associations. So it became a little kind of community of people who lived in a housing association, and that's a story that happened quite a lot over London squats that kind of went legal and became housing associations. So,
and like you said, all these buildings were falling to bits.
Yeah.
In Ponce, Notting Hill, they all fall into bits.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can't imagine it now, can you? But I mean, London was still really reeling from the war, even those 25 odd years later, as in it still hadn't fully been redeveloped in a way.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into the party sort of stuff, but the 70s had all the old squats and abandoned buildings and all that, but so did the 80s and the 90s. For sure, literally, I do think the resonance from the Second World War, there's a deep political argument to be had that we're almost just ending that period now with all realignment of certain political ways things are going, and I kind of see some of that, and again, this is probably a deeper point for another time, but it's almost the final end of this sort of Second World War agreement with sort of America and all sorts of stuff going on.
I mean, it's very true. I think, the fallout of the Second World War lasted a lot longer than those years it took to rebuild and what have you, but so London, that I was in this funny little row of houses, and that generally were people a bit on the hippie kind of end of things, and there's incidentally quite a lot of single mums. But all the dads were finding themselves in India, and the single mums were supporting each other. So we lived downstairs in the basement, and upstairs was our friends and her daughter. So I had a lot of aunties. There was Auntie Jean and Auntie Tanya and Auntie Anne, and a lot of extended kind of. Not all single mums, but women who kind of looked after me, I suppose.
No, but that's a really good community to grow up in, isn't it? You must have felt incredibly supported.
It was rough. It was rough and ready, and I remember we literally had a kind of one of those kind of metal baths for a bit. I remember having a bath in the kitchen in one of those metal baths.
Well, again, like you say that now, Aaron, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it does sound like Dickensian almost.
I know, and you can't imagine it now, can you? Really? I remember when we got a shower because obviously they were updating the house over time, and
you had a fucking shower, mate.
But they put one in probably late 70s, I guess, early 80s, and I was like, wow, we've got a shower. And you know what, actually I can probably date it because I remember getting a bit obsessed with the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and it was around that time we got a shower. So there you go. So it was when the 80s started to happen, they started to modernise these flats, but up till that point I was there for nearly 10 years probably in a very damp basement flat with a communal garden with lots of aunties, and also next door there was musicians around. I think Kilburn's one of those places that was really interesting because it's a very Irish area, but it also had a very kind of bohemian edge to it. It was cheap, so I think a lot of kind of people in the music industry were around there. We were next door to an African musician called Gaspar Lawal, who is actually one of the drummers who played with the Stones, talking about Rolling Stones earlier on in Hyde Park at the famous footage. He's one of the sort of painted drummers when they do Sympathy for the Devil. He was there.
Incredible.
And he was quite a well-known artist in that kind of Afrobeat scene. And then, lots of other people, and a few people I've actually sort of still in touch with now. And then, Kilburn as a place was interesting because even though it was very rough and deprived, it was very, very Irish. So there was a lot of Irish people who'd come to kind of get jobs. So there was, in a way, and the corner of our street was a Mother Teresa hospice. So there was queues of blokes just trying to get a bed, often at the corner of our street. All the Catholic churches were also obviously very full. And Kilburn High Road, I remember it being quite interesting because it had maybe 4 cinemas. It had really big music venues because the Kilburn National was there, and there were lots of Irish pubs with Irish music. And there was lots of music shops. So, there was, I suppose, a sort of feeling of you've got the big music venues, you've got cinemas, and my mum ended up working at one of the cinemas along there. and the kind of music shops. I mean, 4, 5 shops where you could go and have a play with a guitar.
That's amazing.
Which is incredible now, isn't it? You think about it. I mean,
was that for the Irish musicians, or that was like?
I think obviously, there were 3 or 4 big Irish venues there, but they obviously for a while had a sustainable business where they could sell guitar strings and amps. Because
obviously there was
stuff.
A lot of live music in the pubs, particularly in the Irish community.
Yes, for sure. But obviously Ian Dury's first band was called Kilburn and the High Roads.
Yeah.
So it was one of those places that was possibly cheaper than Notting Hill or Westbourne Park. So as that gentrified a bit, people were in Kilburn, and it did definitely have a sort of community of musicians. And of course, a couple of my mum's boyfriends ended up being musicians as well. So I kind of always had a sort of sense of like that world not being something you only see on telly, but people's dads or people's boyfriends or whatever. Or, people we knew were sort of in bands, and in particularly when sort of punk happened a little bit later, I actually kind of knew a few people in that sort of scene, and even ended up on stage as a 7-year-old dressed as a little pretend punk with a punk t-shirt.
I think you told me about it before. Yeah, tell me that story, because that was amazing. Like, did you say there is footage of this out there?
No, I've tried to find it.
Right.
So my mum's boyfriend at the time was a roadie with a band called 999. Some people might know who they were. Kind of second wave of punk, I suppose, just after the Pistols and the Damned. They kind of came similar-ish, but maybe they had a slightly more pop edge to the sound. But and my mum was going out with a roadie in the band. And so, we got into the Roundhouse, which obviously was both a music venue, a legendary music venue with a very countercultural history, but also did theatre. And I remember going to see the Canterbury Tales there, and I saw Hamlet there, and I went with my school to see shows. It was a real community space, and it had lots of ups and downs, didn't it? And obviously it comes back in my film a bit later.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's a long history going back to the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, there was a good documentary on it that BBC made, which was fascinating for me to watch. But yeah, so I ended up kind of drinking 3 or 4 cans of Coke off the rider, and kind of getting on stage, or somebody helped me on. I can't even remember, but I definitely have a vivid image in my mind of sort of pogoing in a 7-year-old way while the band was on. And people kind of laughing and pointing and looking at me, and then the band being a bit confused as to like I was sort of taking the limelight a little bit by being this, little git.
Yeah, kids are annoying like that. Everyone looks at the little kid. They're like, oh.
Yeah.
It's like if you do an online interview or something and the cat goes behind, everyone looks at the cat.
Yeah, like, oh, look, the cat. Yeah, look. Can we have a chat? Yeah.
Oh.
So I mean, maybe that gave me a feeling of, you could do it. You could do it. It wasn't.
Did you enjoy that being on stage? Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
You're loving it.
Yeah, probably bloated my 7-year-old ego to think that I was a little rock star at the time. And it did really stay with me as a place, physical place. It became quite special to me, the Roundhouse generally. And I think, a sense that, you can sort of do it, as in being a musician or being an artist or whatever. But yeah, I was all right at school. So, and I was into drama. So, I did drama and plays and that kind of stuff. But that was kind of, I suppose, that the 70s bit of my story really leading up to the 80s when we did eventually move, but not very far, just around the corner to where my mum is now.
Yeah, where's that?
So basically just off the Kingsgate Road, but a tiny little bit further up towards West Hampstead, I suppose it's called. Yeah. East Kilburn, as it was sometimes known as well.
Well, they probably want to call it West Hampstead now.
They do definitely want to call it West Hampstead. But, it's back then it was a very different place from Hampstead.
Well, I know there was loads of Scots in Hampstead, and there's famously like John Lydon and, Sid Vicious, John Beverley lived in squats up in Hampstead, and I know there's a little row there where they lived, and apparently he wrote the lyrics to "God Save the Queen" while having baked beans on toast, which I always think is the way to do it.
Famously, as in another memory I've got of that kind of punk world. Was that I was at a little school called St Mary's off the Kilburn High Road. I don't even know if it's actually physically there anymore. I think it moved a bit further around the corner. And it's quite another, it was a one-form entry sort of junior school. State school. And one time my mum was picking me up, and the entirety of the pistols came from a pub called the Bird in the Hand pub. That was the pub that we used to, turn up when we were carol singing and try and get all of the old biddies to give us 10p in the pot.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And we would have our kind of cup of soup. And they all came out, and it was
amazing.
Sid lied, and they were all there. And my mum said, "Oh, it's the Pistols," and I didn't know who they were. But it stuck in my mind of like people that you'd seen on telly are just there. They're not. It's not like they're just all some sort of distant superheroes. They're just people that live around the corner.
I know Sid lived in Maida Vale for a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, again, super zhuzhy now, Maida Vale, but was full of squats.
Yeah, exactly. And I lived in Westbourne Park at the end of the 80s, and I was right next to the roads where all the squats were that Strummer and all that lived in. And it still had a little bit of that, and when I was there, it was still a bit rough and ready. But
well, I think a lot. It's an age-old story that's happened a lot. Is that areas that are deprived, but that have got space, is where artists and creative people will go. Oh, I can move here. I can do it for free, and we can make our band, or we can paint, or we can write, or they can do things cheaply, and they can get on with that development phase, I suppose, of making. And, so,
that's what you need. Yeah,
totally. And I think a lot of those areas became hotbeds of sort of culture because they were cheap, free, even, and we don't really have spaces like that anymore. Places that people can kind of, and of course people were probably on the dole, so they were probably getting their 30 quid a week or whatever it was, and that gave them a little bit of space to be in a band, to try this, to make.
No,
not everybody succeeded, but it meant
I know, but you need to try. For some reason that area, the Kilburn, Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, a little bit.
Yeah,
it's always had like a real radical element to it. You know, partly with all like the sort of black history and like down All Saints Road and the Mangrove and all that.
Absolutely, yeah.
I used to know Caroline Coon, who was the one who gave punk its name, I believe.
Right, yeah.
And she used to run Release, which was the drugs, and charity in the 60s.
Right.
And
were they on the All Saints Road? I can't remember.
I'm not sure. There's an amazing documentary on YouTube. Well, I say documentary, it's like a short half an hour thing. Getting It Straight in Notting Hill Gate. Have you ever seen that?
No.
And that's got it's got her in it, and it's a band Quintessence are playing.
It's one of the psychedelic kind of.
They're total hippie band from the time, and I think they might have been playing at the Tabernacle which is in Power Square,
which my mum worked at.
There we go. But
it's serving food, and David Bowie, a very young David Bowie before he was famous, was there. So.
Okay, all right. Oh mate, yeah. Yes, you got to check it out. But
sounds great.
But again, it's that area, and obviously all the space rock, the Hawkwinds, and all that sort of stuff coming out.
Absolutely.
So it's just there's a really, I don't know what it is. There's a really weird psychogeographical sort of thing in that area of like all the, like I said, subcultural from all different angles. Definitely. Like I said, you mix the Irish, mix the black stuff, mix the weird white Hawkwind stuff, and all the hippies. I don't know what it is.
And and obviously that was the famous sign, wasn't it? Sort of no blacks, no Irish, no hippies. That was the signs that you would see.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And that was the kind of makeup generally of the area that I lived in, know.
Oh, amazing.
It's definitely a story that is, I think, is a dwindling story, that poor areas that have got a kind of an energy to them that are largely empty and abandoned get taken up by people doing it themselves, squatting or creating housing co-ops or whatever, and making stuff, and then those places become vibrant, and then of course what happens is they become trendy, and then they become gentrified because people start buying them up, or councils sell off places and they get sold to people, and that's the story of London, really.
There's a whole story, even like the last podcast I did with Chris Dexter from Planet Wax, we talked the whole thing about Deptford, and Deptford has been like the standard for about 20 years. Every year we're doing like the most up and coming place is Deptford. They'd always and I'd be like, it's not done it yet. It's not, and it's gradually doing it, but it's still just about holding on.
Yeah.
But the battle's ongoing there because there's loads of good, there's a whole vibrant scene down there.
Yeah.
But I'm just hoping it manages to hold on.
It's tough, isn't it? I mean, Deptford obviously got battered in the war, so it was the place apparently where when the German bombers were kind of on their way back across the channel, and if they had any bombs left, they'd just let them all out in southeast London.
They're like, oh fuck it, let's bomb Deptford.
Which well, they didn't know where it was. They just had to get rid of all the payload, and they were just to help them with getting the petrol.
Do you know what? I will say one thing that obviously, like, we're sitting now in my flat. I live in a council estate right by the river in Bermondsey.
Yeah.
And like one of the things about this area that again they're redoing up Canada Water and all around here.
Yeah.
And one of the things is there's so many council houses, estates around here that it's a bit hard to get rid of all of us because they built loads after the Second World War because this area did get bombed to fuck.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of the houses that got bombed were like slums anyway.
They could be, yeah. But
what I'm saying is, it's hard to get rid of all of us in one go.
Yeah.
So there's part of me,
there's a lot of council and social
maybe
housing.
I'm glad certain bits got bombed and they put all the social housing in, and it's not easy to flick the switch. Obviously they did it at the Haygate up at Elephant and got rid of a whole estate.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, and I mean, it's a slow erosion, but it certainly accelerated, I think, in the 90s, noughties and 10s, didn't it? But...
All right, but back to you. Let's go back to you. So yeah, we're like, Kilburn in the early 80s. So then, what was early music sort of stuff that you started getting into? Like, either were you buying like 7-inch singles or stuff like that, or?
Yeah, so I mean, my mum was obviously always into music, and one day I'll inherit her vinyl collection because it's pretty good. But I used to like collecting 7-inches, and I didn't buy a lot of my early 7-inches, partly because my mum and a boyfriend of hers at the time, Jim, who was also a bass player in a band and did session and all kinds of bands, they also used to occasionally run a stall in Portobello Market, and they used to sell 7-inches and vinyl. When I think of the stuff they probably sold now and how collectible it would have been.
Yeah.
But I have inherited a few of those things, so I've got everything in there. So in a way, I was listening to stuff that I hadn't bought, which was a right old mix. So I have got the two first Sex Pistols on 7-inch, the two first releases, but then I also had Tubby the Tuba, and I had Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs, and
that's
those
a classic,
sorts of things. So my 7-inch collection is almost like what I was given before I started buying music.
Yeah, well, do you know what? You dig through stuff. I mean, I used to go for my grand's 7-inches, and I used to remember appalling 7-inches that she had. But I'll be sitting on the record player at 6 or 7, going through them and finding ones I liked.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think through that bit, there was a phase where I started buying the odd thing from Woolworths, and I actually think probably somewhat confusingly, and this will probably date it, when you first got enough pocket money or whatever to buy a 7-inch. I think the first one I bought was the Boxer Beat by Doing the Boxer Beat, whichever. I think they were called the Joe Boxers, and the track was Doing the Boxer Beat. So that was the first single I actually remember physically going into.
Do you know who Sean McCluskey is? Do you know Sean McCluskey? He did loads of clubs.
Right, I know the name. Yes.
Yeah, he did like Club UK and stuff like that.
Yes.
And actually, I have asked him to have a chat one time. He said he'd be up for it, but he was in Joe Boxers. Yeah.
Really?
He was in Joe Boxers because funny enough, I was at a boot fair. So I'm sidetracking again. I always go off sidetrack. But I was at a boot fair recently. For some reason, there was loads of Joe Boxer records there. I'd never seen that many Joe Boxer records.
They had one tune.
It was something like 2 or 3 albums. I was like, wow, okay. Yeah. And obviously, on all of them, I could see him. Then I was like, oh yeah, that is Sean. But
I guess, I've got no idea when that was, 81, 82.
Yeah, it was early 81, 82-ish, so sort of, maybe 83, yeah, exactly.
10 or 11 or something. But I have got a vivid memory of buying it because it was the song that was stuck in my head.
Yeah.
And then fairly shortly after that, I remember buying Rocket. Obviously, at the time was, the anthem when I was at school, because hip hop and electro was arriving from America, and my mum was very eclectic music taste, so she had a lot of disco and funk from the 70s. So I kind of grew up listening to all of that alongside the punk stuff, alongside Bowie, You know, I remember vividly looking at the front cover of the Diamond Dogs album, being kind of completely mesmerised by it. You know, what the hell is this? You know, dog person kind of. So, but dance music was always there as well, because my mum had been a mod and she was listening to soul, you know, back in the 60s, and then, you know, loved, you know, Donna Summer in the 70s and Funkadelic and all of that kind of thing. So when I suppose the early electro came over, and it was, you know, kids at my school were body popping and all of that sort of stuff, it didn't feel like a jump to me. It felt kind of comparable, because it was a street-led movement, and the music was from outer space.
It was a totally thing that went through the schools. Like, you know, kids
were body popping because we were suddenly wearing trainers.
Were you body popping?
I could body pop a little bit. I could never break dance particularly. I was a popper rather than a break dancer. People probably don't even know the difference, but it was upright basically. And it was all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, right. I can do it on full. Yeah, I need a big kind of camera lens for that.
Okay,
but
we'll film that later.
But so the very early 80s, my junior school, when I was still at junior school, I remember that happening, and it was a big deal. And then I had a weird thing happen, because I had oddly started school possibly early, because I was an end of October kid. For my last year at school, I was meant to go to secondary school, but I stayed. I ended up having to stay at school, because they said, "No, you're too young. You're like 2 months too young to go to secondary school."
You're 2 months. You're 2. Anyway, so
And so I ended up having to stay at school for another year.
That must have been like.
Yeah. So all my mates in my class.
That must have
been
devastating, because at that age you're like.
Yeah.
Well, I'm staying with all like the young'uns.
The younger kids.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I had quite a bad year at school, where people were quite kind of, you know, I made 1 or 2 friends, but generally they were quite suspicious of me.
Talk about a way to make you like stick out and just like, you know. I must imagine you're some big kid with your little shorts, and they're just going, "Who's that? Who's that?"
Well, I was always quite sort of skinny, so I wasn't like a big tough guy anyway. But and it kind of coincided with a little bit of a shift from that kind of community vibe in the late 70s and to the early 80s, to suddenly the kids at the council estate across the road used to call us squatters, you know, because even though they'd been legal housing for 10 years, there was a certain element of, you know, a kind of, I don't know whether it was like the onset of the 80s happening, but there was a certain element of, you know, a divide between council estate kids and us, the kids at the housing co-op, and the brand new estate that had been built right next door on the bomb site. So we used to play on the bomb site. That was basically a building site for 5 years or so, and then it became a council block, council estate. One of those kind of flat ones, you know, not a kind of high rise like this one. And so that was obviously a whole new playground, but it sort of changed the vibe of the area a little bit, so that we became a minority, funnily enough. You know, before that there was no sense of that. You know, I remember the 1977 Jubilee, and my mum playing God Save the Queen out the window while everyone was having their street party, and it was all fine. You know, everything was all quite together. But did feel in the early 80s that there was a divide, and the council estate kids throwing stones at our windows, calling us squatters and that sort of thing. And it happened to coincide with this bad year I had at school, where the kids and me, I didn't really gel with the kids there, and they were, you know, I got bullied a bit basically. So I was a bit different. And then went to secondary school. I think the 80s sort of took over to a certain extent. Obviously around that time it was the miners' strike, and one of my early memories of that era was my mum. I was a bit of a latchkey kid, being a single parent, and my mum was at work, and I think I'd come back from school, and she said, "Oh, there's 5 bags of clothes there, and at some point somebody will be coming from the miners, so just, you know, give them the clothes, you know." That were my instructions basically, and I hadn't really thought about it, but I knew that there'd been a lot of stuff on the news, and I remember having, you know, the badges, you know, support the miners, and all
coal not dole and all that sort of
coal
stuff.
not dole. And I remember this guy turning up, who was obviously a miner from somewhere up north, and I said, my mum told me to give you this, and he said, "Thank you, bless you," and he said, "Go and get yourself a Mars bar," and he gave me 13p.
Okay.
And I said, no, because I was like, we're giving something to him.
Yeah, sure.
And he said, no, but I insist, go on, get me. And he put this 13p in my hand, and he made me close my hand, and he left. He took the bags of clothes, and I remember thinking, that's not enough for a Mars bar.
Yeah.
But I still felt like I had to buy a Mars bar because he told me to go get a Mars bar. So I scrabbled together the whatever 10p else that I had and went and bought a Mars bar. And it really stuck with me, of that thing of like looking after people, but him being so grateful. And I was a kid.
Well, it's quite amazing. Like, you're getting miners' support in Kilburn in the early 80s. Obviously, there's not many coal mines in Kilburn, are there?
No, but I think it did feel like there was a sort of struggle, you know, a them and us situation. You know,
well, I'd started going to gigs by then, 84, 85.
Yeah.
I was going to gigs at stuff like Woolwich Poly, and there was always like miners' benefits, and that was one of the, I don't know, again,
the big causes.
Yeah, I get, if you're like young person, you're sort of I don't know, left wing politics or something. Yeah, the miners were definitely like. Yeah, and obviously we had the GLC in London then.
GLC, yeah,
you know, so you know, and I always do a salute to Red Ken. You know, I was still like, you know.
Well, he lived in our little run of flats.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so he was one of the other people who was literally on our little
with
street.
His newts. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a neighbour. Dialing back to another story that might be interesting is I do have a vivid memory of going on the Rock Against Racism march. And I think my mum wasn't big on crowds, which is why we didn't go to a lot of festivals and gigs when I was kind of growing up. She went to the Bath Free Festival, that was the precursor to Glastonbury. And it was so kind of full on for her. She was like, I'm not going to go to any of those. She didn't end up going to the free festivals so much. You know, it was too much. She was a bit more urban, I suppose. But what we did go to was the big one at Victoria Park, Rock Against Racism, which now has been celebrated, and there's footage kind of. There was a great documentary that was released, and there is also a film that was done as a sort of spin-off that used footage of
Rude
being
Boy
on stage. That's right.
Yeah.
Which I know was not universally loved, but
no, I mean, look,
an interesting document.
It's one of them films. It's kind of it's not the best film, but do you know what? It's an amazing document of the time, and
incredible kind of access to be on the stage and to use that footage of the band. But there is a picture somewhere, and I don't know if it's in my mind, but it's a picture of me, my mum, and I think a boyfriend or maybe a friend, not quite in the crowds, but with the crowds kind of in the background, and the stage in the background, which she's digging out all the photos, so maybe it'll be discovered.
If you find that one, we'll cut that in. Should have got on stage for that one, mate, and like should have, you know, as
50,000 people between us.
Exactly.
Didn't know the Clash at that stage, so or wherever.
Yeah, but do you know what? Who else was it played there? It was like
I think Sham 69. Played. I think most probably Aswad. I think certainly it was that interesting mix of the reggaes and the punks were seen in some ways as the sort of two sides of the same rebellious coin, you know, fighting the Nazis and fascists. That's an interesting one, isn't it? It's kind of a little bit like one of those glues of subcultures that's on the outside doesn't seem quite like it makes sense, but because of places like Notting Hill, Westbourne Park, that's where people were living. So they were listening to reggae from their neighbour, and they were in a punk band. So I think it was very much a kind of, and even Bob Marley made that punky reggae track, didn't he? So I think it was something.
Well, again, the famous story of the early punk stuff was like places like the Roxy, they didn't have the records went out, so you had someone like Don Letts who was just playing loads of reggae, and I know people like Lyden and all that really into the reggae sort of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah, and it was rebel music, you know.
First thing he did when he left the Pistols, you know, was fuck off to Jamaica with Richard Branson's money and sign up loads of
make a record or two.
Well, and then made one of the most amazing, you know, new wave punk dub records with Pill. That's going. You know? Yeah,
totally. Jar Wobble obviously had that dubby influence to it, his bass playing and everything. So yeah, for sure. I think that's an interesting kind of combine. And when we talk a little bit about the film, I think those moments of youth cultures kind of unifying are usually where the real exciting explosions have happened, I think, when everybody's in their disparate little boxes, which tended to happen, I think, in the 80s more. You know, goths over here, indie kids over here, punks and mods, the resurgence.
In one way, that was the time of the Style Tribe. So, you know, and this has always been an amazing thing about UK culture, as in we've always been very sort of tribal in our dress, our clothes, everything. You know, so you either this or that. You know, like you said, your mum was a mod, and then flick of the switch, she's a hippie.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying it's that simple.
Smoke of the tie stick.
Smoke of the tie stick. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a terrible thing
Not
about drugs.
incriminating my mother in any way.
Exactly.
Course,
Exactly. That's you need to be careful. If you careful for any viewers out there. If you smoke weed, you could end up become a hippie. So beware. Be careful.
Yeah, beware.
You'll be like tie down your t-shirts soon. All right. So you got your records from Woolworths. What about stuff? Were you going out? When did you start going out to gigs, or even other sort of stuff?
Again, I sort of feel lucky in some ways that I was sort of going to gigs almost before I would have gone to gigs. So, like I said about 999 and festivals like the one at Victoria Park, the Rock Against Racism. So it was sort of around, and then I suppose, personally, when I started going out, wasn't till a bit later. So the sort of 80s, I kind of dipped into various sort of, I suppose, genres. I was into hip hop to a certain extent, but I went through a little metal phase, which I think everybody's got to at least have 6 months of being into a bit of metal. So I got into my AC/DC and all of that kind of thing. I want
to say I've never had a metal phase. I just want to make that clear.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's coming. Oh my God, can you imagine? No. What? Yeah.
I did have a little metal phase. And of course, then that blended into being back into music from the 60s and 70s. So Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath and Jimi Hendrix. And I became a bit of a Jimi Hendrix obsessive about 85, 86. So I wasn't going to gigs that I was particularly into the music that was all the music I was into because it was music from the 60s and 70s actually. But the first sort of time I actually went out, I think was on my 16th birthday, and we dressed up all hippie and we went to Alice in Wonderland, which was a club in Soho, which I definitely don't think exists anymore, but it was a kind of psychedelic night. And I think it was
at Gossips on a Monday night. Because I did actually go there a few times. So,
yes. And it was kind of like because I think a lot of the time in the post-punk era, it was very uncool to be a hippie, because obviously, John Lydon said Johnny Rotten said never trust a hippie.
Well, I grew up and I was I was a proto-punk as a kid, so anything. There was a period when I couldn't listen to any of the like Led Zeppelin or I know they're not necessarily hippie, but anything pre-punk. Even it took me years to be able to handle listening to Pink Floyd and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So I had a year zero approach,
Yeah. Absolutely. It was. I think that was because of the waves that had happened. Rock and roll swept away what came before. Psychedelia swept away what came before. Punk swept away, and then obviously we talk about acid house. In a way, those were like so all engrossing, those movements, that you couldn't.
But you know what?
But it did change.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? There's a thing I've been, I guess, reacquainting myself with just by old music magazines, that punk became really uncool as well.
It did quite quickly.
Quite quickly. The late 70s and the early 80s, and it was almost people were embarrassed by it.
Yeah. And
it was almost seen as like a sort of joke. And almost like it took about 20 years, again, for people to suddenly go, oh yeah, it's cool DIY.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the regrets for me is I used to go places where you'd see a lot of the old punk fanzines and stuff like that you used to pick up for 50p or something like that now go for hundreds of quid because they're all
sure, collectible, I know. And they were just done in someone's, printing press.
But I remember, record shops where they'd sell all the old punk memorabilia in the 80s for virtually nothing.
No, I know.
And now they're sort of museum pieces, if you like, some of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And like we were saying earlier, the 80s was very tribal. So, whatever tribe you were in that tribe. And obviously there was casuals and there was all of that football hoolie thing that kind of wore Tashina. And I remember part of the reason why there was a sort of, I wasn't quite in during the 80s was you had to wear this clobber. You had to have the lowest jeans, you had to have your Tashini tracksuit, you had to have Lacoste t-shirt, and we were quite skint. My single mum, and I remember trying to join the tribe of that kind of thing a little bit, just to fit in a little bit, because we got clothing vouchers when I went to secondary school. And we went to a place called Temples in just off the Edgware Road that was basically where all the casuals got all their clothes. And so I could use my clothing vouchers.
Oh wow, you could actually
get some semi-casual gear. So I had the kind of the sort of fleck trousers, the Lacoste t-shirt, and I had a Pringle jumper. And for a little bit I was in.
I just found a Pringle the other day. It's like an early 80s one.
Yeah. Mine actually.
That was a couple of quid at a boot fair. Yeah.
The lemon yellow. It's a bizarre thing, really.
Oh
isn't it?
yes,
lemon yellow. Yeah.
But you know what? I mean, we were talking just before filming about all the clothes I've got in my flat, and I love clothes, but I was similar. Well, one parent family, free school meals, didn't have money,
me too,
and all the kids at schools had Farrah's and Pringles and the costs, and I couldn't afford that, you know. And so, if you like, part of me thinks, maybe now I'm so into my clothes is like, I always had that sort of thing of
a little
like,
bit of FOMO.
Exactly, you know.
No, it's true. I mean, in a way, I was just doing it to fit in a bit because it's secondary school.
Do you know what? You want to fit in, don't you?
Yeah.
Like no one wants to be the person who's like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and I think through that middle bit of the 80s, before I found the hippie thing, I went through a little, like I said, a little metal phase, and then I kind of found my ability.
Can we cut in a picture of you with some hair metal? Like, we got it.
I don't know if I've got any.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever had the hair, actually.
Right, okay.
Never quite had the hair. And I got into funnily enough, I got into the kind of hippie thing partly around watching the film Platoon, and I got a bit obsessed with the Vietnam War.
Wow.
Because obviously for the year I was born, it was like the waters I was born into,
Yeah.
And so I started dressing in army clobber from Lawrence Corner. There was a sort of army place that you could get,
All right,
old army clothes.
All right, this is definitely a diversion, but I've been talking to a lot of people about Lawrence Corner. Yeah, tell me about Lawrence Corner, because like that's where you could buy all the old military stuff, wasn't it?
I think Lawrence Corner was a really interesting thing because it was all old military clothes from kind of all around the world. So my first sort of fashion, after I got out of the trying to look like everybody else.
It was in Camden, wasn't it? Or more like between Euston and Camden?
Euston, yeah.
It was...
And it was, I think probably 85, 80, maybe 86, I went and bought a Russian-style trench coat, grey trench coat. And then that was one look I had, this trench coat thing, when I was about 14, I suppose. And then I bought army trousers and an army shirt. And it was a German army, so it must have been, whatever, bought cheaply from Europe. And I got a bit obsessed with Platoon. And I was listening to Jimi Hendrix. And then from there, a little bit like my mum in the mid-60s to the late 70s, my hair started growing out and I started, exploring, trying to, get a bit of weed and smoke and, failing a bit and, having a whitey and all of that sort of stuff. And then my hair grew out fully, and by the time I'd kind of done my A-levels and stuff like that, I'd done my GCSEs, so whenever I was 16 or so, we went to Alice in Wonderland, and I was dressed in that kind of hippie style.
Yeah, so I do remember.
87.
I do remember people had the frilly sort of shirts in there.
Yeah,
and I did have my goth moment, I have to admit. But I wasn't so into the Alice in Wonderland look.
Yeah,
it's a bit too much patchouli for me.
It was very patchouli. It was quite dressed up, wasn't it? In a way, it was very sort of. It was almost a bit sort of snobbishly hippie, if you could say such a thing.
It was that.
You had to have the full outfit, crushed velvet.
Exactly. There was a lot of crushed velvet.
Yeah.
And like
girls with the goth element. So I guess that kind of merging of the goth and the hippie thing, like Doctor and the Medics, I suppose. That a little bit.
They were the big band of that sort of.
Yeah.
That night, weren't they?
That's right. That was a lot of their sort of thing where it was like. Obviously they did the Norman Greenbaum Spirit in the Sky, which is a 60s kind of psychedelic kind of anthem. And it was a funny little moment where the sort of goth hippie kind of thing kind of started to merge. And I think in some ways the hippie thing paved the way came a year or two later with Acid House looking back to the 60s, because up to that point, the punks had not wanted to do that. but somehow things got more baggy, and people started to wear flares again, and things weren't.
Well, I think the word acid obviously gave.
And the word acid,
because what I remember as well from that was a period I was over West London, and I remember going to these sort of talks and stuff, and Fraser Clark was doing them.
Yes,
who
I met a few times.
Yeah, and I went to see, who was it? It was the guy. Who's the guy with mushrooms? Terence McKenna.
Yes,
I saw Terence McKenna.
Yeah,
at a Fraser Clark thing.
Right.
And there was a thing with Tibetan singing bowls.
Yeah.
Which was like the classic. You know what they are, the Tibetan?
Yes. Yeah.
You sort of you rub the sort of, but you actually do start. They do trip you out.
They hit a frequency somehow.
They do actually hit some frequency. It actually is true.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I remember going to Fraser Clark thing like that.
Right.
And there was one I think with Robert Anton Wilson as well.
Who was here in London. Wow.
Illuminati sort of thing. So there was all that sort of and that was, I'm not sure exactly the year. That's probably 87, 88 or something like that.
Yeah. And in some ways that was when the kind of hippie thing was kind of back. And I think obviously in some ways the other side of the political story, we talked about the miners, was that at the same time, there was this free festival thing still happening, and obviously it got crushed at the Battle of the Beanfield, which is obviously a part of my film story. And the backdrop of the sort of counterculture in some way was that people had kept that spirit going, and it had also been infused with the punk spirit as well, because a lot of urban punks had gone out there.
Well, I guess this was the thing for me. It took me a little while to get my head around, because like I said, I grew up loving the Sex Pistols when I was a kid.
Me too.
And I'd be playing Nevermind the Bollocks non-stop. And so, I was very militant. Like I said, I was anti-hippie.
Yeah.
But then it took me a while to obviously realise that some of the original hippies were actually pretty radical and hardcore.
Absolutely,
like your Hawkwinds and all them sort of people were I would have called hippies, but obviously they're as hardcore as a lot of the punks were. You wouldn't fuck with them. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You wouldn't fuck with them. You're not going to fuck with Lemmy or even all the members of Hawkwind.
Absolutely, yeah. Despite how acid fueled so much of it was, they were radical, and their sound, I think, inspired quite a lot of the early punks. I think there's been a lot of there's quite a good documentary on Hawkwind, which Mick Jones from the Clash said that they would bunk into Hawkwind gigs because they were nearby Westbourne Park.
When you think about what are the weird fucking gigs in the early 70s, fucking Hawkwind are loads of them.
They were a whole world, really, weren't they?
And funny enough, I just found this pile of a load of IT magazine.
Yeah,
there's one from 1970. And there's a whole page in there, and they go, let's introduce you to the new band of the underground, and it's Hawkwind.
Yeah.
And they were going about this band who've just formed, and they're all out this. Well, I guess the Scots counterculture, West London.
Yeah. Absolutely. It was a kind of. My friend Joe Banks has written a really amazing book on Hawkwind. If you're into that kind of.
Do you know what? I've got the book that's on my massive pile that I haven't read yet.
It's a big one.
Yeah, I've got it. I have got it.
Sounds of the Underground.
Yes, exactly. I have got it.
Yeah.
Or no, maybe I haven't got that one. It's the one with interviews that he did as well. That he did as an accompaniment, or maybe it's...
Could well be.
I think I might have the one with all the interviews.
It's called Sounds of the Underground anyway. It came out a couple of years back.
Okay.
And I ended up being in a band with Joe. He was in one
amazing.
of the bands I was in, so he's a friend and he lives locally to me.
So we're going all over the shop, but that's good. That's kind of what I do in the podcast. But we're talking about how the hippies were sort of
It felt kind of like the hippie thing was sort of allowed back in.
It was allowed back in, and like I said, I was...
Yeah.
Maybe I was finally thinking, well, not all of it was
absolutely.
Maybe they shouldn't all be dead.
Exactly. And then I had two kind of pivotal moments, I suppose, which sort of shaped things for me. So I went to sixth form I was still living at my mum's, and I went to sixth form in Finsbury Park, off the Holloway Road, near Finsbury Park, but sort of Highbury, Holloway Road area, which was in that area was it was full of squats and stuff around there. People can't imagine it, but where the big Sainsbury's is now, interestingly, there was a huge squatting community there. It's all gone, but Interestingly, Simon from Spiral Tribe, who I obviously has played a big kind of important part in the story in my film, was one of the people living in those squats, and I went to one of my first sort of parties there, but not at her place, but at a party called a Low Life party. I started sixth form in September '88, but that summer I'd gone on a cycling holiday with my mate Tristan, very good friend of mine.
Yeah.
And we'd gone to sort of visit his uncle in Glastonbury, he lived in Glastonbury town. In fact, he was a stonemason. And of course, within about a mile of cycling outside of Glastonbury, my bike broke. So he just had to abandon the bike, took it back to his uncle's, I think. And, we had a night drinking cider and, hanging out with all these old hippies. And Tristan's dad was a bit of an old hippie. And they were all really from that kind of Glastonbury traveller type background. Some of them lived in the town, but obviously they knew the convoy, they knew the peace convoy, that kind of scene. And then we took our tent and we had to go on buses, to get around. And we thought we'd go kind of get to where the tour was. And we got to the tour, and there was just all these trucks and buses and this convoy. And we were like, what is going on? And it kind of scared us a little bit because we were just these like ponytailed sort of urban,
city boys,
who were kind of, I suppose, about to go and do their A-levels, and we weren't kind of naughty in any way, but we were sort of exploring that side of us, and we'd had a few spliffs, and we were kind of, we were into that kind of world, and obviously that's part of the world I grew up in. I remember we arrived there, and this kind of West Country kid just sort of sat down next to me, started skinning up and said, all right there. And he just started blasting us with, so, come on. And he got us really stoned to like that kind of paranoid stoned. So we just sort of, that night, got in our tent, slept and left and went to somewhere near Cheddar or something on a bus, We had a little transistor radio, and the next night we heard thousands of hippies are gathering at Glastonbury Tor for the 8th of the 8th, 1988. And we thought, this is fucking Woodstock on our kind of, this is where we got to go. And so what we didn't realise was that it was part of the convoy travelling festival circuit. It happened to be decided that the 8th of the 8th, 1988 was a numerologically important date, and that's why everyone was gathering at Glastonbury Tor. Basically, that's where the convoy was.
It's good logic. I mean, sure we decided that.
But it's like chaos magic, isn't it? It's like, it doesn't really matter the reason.
No, cool.
It's happening anyway.
It's all the eights.
All the eights. Eight's the magic number in China, and so anyway. Yeah. So we ended up camping at like a little campsite about a 3-mile walk from the tour, and just took a little trip, as you would say, up to the tour itself, and it blew our mind because it was basically a free festival, dogs everywhere, people with bongos, people with dreads, looking wild and tattooed and freaky. And I'd said to my friend, if someone offers us some acid, I'm going to buy it. And he went, yeah, all right, And sure enough,
I was going to say, fatal words.
The fatal words.
What are the chances that someone's going to offer you some?
Yeah. Within, I don't know, half an hour, we were up there, and a kind of hippie and his beautiful kind of girlfriend who kind of wafted up to us, acid, and I was like, yeah, how much? And they said £4, and it had a salamander on it. I remember that, and he said, do you do a lot of acid? And he must have looked at me thinking, this guy does not do a lot of acid. No. Green as anything, little dodgy ponytail. And I said,
want to do 3 of them, mate?
Yeah. And he said, you should probably only have a half. And I thought,
okay, that's responsible.
Yeah. So we bought this for £4, and his girlfriend wafted away, and they sort of wandered. And then we just sort of cut it into quarters and took a quarter each, and just sat at the edge of Glastonbury Tor. And we were kind of we didn't know how long it took, and we were a bit freaked out because there was just hustle and bustle and all these freaks everywhere, and bongos and dogs, and the dogs, we were sort of waiting for it to work, and then out of the blue 200 crusty dogs just came running past us, and we had a kind of a panic, and we were like, we've just got to get back to the tent, we were just terrified. And so we started the 3-mile walk back to the tent, And we were leaving the Free Festival because it was just a bit too much for us to be coming up. And we didn't really know what that even meant, you know. And it was a beautiful night, but we were a bit like, oh, let's just get back to the tent, you know, we'll be fine. And then we got, you know, within about, I suppose, half a mile of the tent. And we knew that there was a few ancient sites around there because we'd seen a few sort of tourists looking for stuff earlier on. And we realised we were being followed. And we were like, oh, fuck, what's happening? You know, there's some of those hippies are following us, you know, with their terrifying dogs. And we looked back and there was these sort of, for us, there was these hippies following us. And we said, keep walking, keep walking. We turned back and they weren't anymore. They were pirates coming towards us. And we thought, what's going on, you know? And we just said, keep walking, keep walking. We turned around and they weren't pirates anymore. They were real straights, all dressed in tennis gear. And I was like, and they actually were. And they suddenly stopped us. And they went, excuse me, do you know the way to Ogog and Magog, the ancient trees? Yeah. And I just went, excuse me, mate, is that a tennis racket? And he went, yeah. And then he suddenly realised we were totally coming up on this acid for the first time and just started falling apart laughing at all these people in the tennis clobber, and just the absurdity of the fact that a minute before we were convinced that we were pirates trying to kill us. And we just cracked up laughing. They all went off to go and see Ogog and Magog, the ancient trees, 1,000-year-old trees. And that was it. And that was the rest of our... And so for the next 12 hours, we got back to finally found our way to the tent, sat by a fabulous old oak tree and had our first full psychedelic experience and listened to, you know, Beatles' White Album and I remember listening to Sgt. Pepper's on a tape and my battery was going on the thing. So it was starting to go like that. I didn't know if it was me.
Did you get all the messages from the White Album?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, I remember the benefit of Mr. Kite being dum-de-dim-de-dum-de-dum-de. And so it was like I had a full psychedelic experience then, and that was just
it's a good place to do your first acid. You know?
I think if ever there was a place to do it, that was the place to do it. And I think it gave a certain sense that this was a sort of door opening in some way. And yeah, shortly after that, probably within a few weeks of that, I went to sixth form and I arrived at sixth form and I was a full hippie who just had my first acid experience on Glastonbury Tor. And everyone there had smiley T-shirts and everything starts with an E badges. And I was like, what's this, you know? And yeah, it took me probably 6 months to a year to kind of fall into it, because at first I was like, no, keep music live, and what is all this music that's being made with electronics? But it was an inevitable wave, and I almost kind of clicked the most with a girl I found quite attractive with long kind of hippie hair, had a smiley badge, and I thought, okay, I'm all in.
Sometimes that's all it takes, Aaron.
It's often the way.
Yeah, easily convinced.
Yeah.
Do you remember like the first nights you started going out to for that sort of stuff?
So I remember trying to get into a night at Cricklewood Village, which was a place in kind of where a friend of mine, Jason, lived, and we kind of went, and it was like 10 quid to get in, and we looked through the door and we didn't have the money, and it was just bandanas and this, and we were just a bit like, I can't afford it, and you know, we didn't know anything about ecstasy really at that point, and so we didn't go. And then we did go to the Camden Palace, which had a night, and I'm guessing this must have been early '89, and it was I remember there was a track that seemed to play for about 25 minutes non-stop, and I've since found out that it is actually a 25-minute track. It's a classic piece of early 80s German krautrock, in fact.
E2, E4?
Yes, by...
Manuel Goshing.
Goshing, yes.
So, I'm pronouncing it,
yeah.
Something like that.
So it was some sort of...
No, I mean, that's been sampled loads.
House version.
And exactly, there's the full version, I've got a feeling it might even be like 40 minutes.
It's like an entire side of the EP or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's incredible.
And I remember hearing that, and it all just sort of made sense. And I wasn't on any drugs really, I don't think. I'd just been having a few drinks, but and it was just, it made sense, this thing of just kind of letting yourself go into the music, and I was still wearing my long grey trench coat.
Your Russian overcoat.
So I hadn't quite got out of that thing, but quite quickly after that I kind of, you know, started to wear a bit more sporty clothes, and the hair turned into the dread thing, and then really the crossover full for me, as in when I I suppose I fully embraced it, but from the angle that I was, which was a bit more of a hippie, indie kind of guitar-y kind of person, was when I went to Club Dog, which was at the Finsbury Park, George Robey, which is sadly doesn't exist anymore. And that was the combination. So it was the psychedelic element, it was the hippie, crusty kind of element.
Well,
and then it was
Club Dog did
music.
combine them elements. That was their. Because I used to go down Club Dog. I used to live around the corner for a while.
Yeah.
And I went down the early ones there, and it's quite empty in there in the Dog. But but that was the link up with. Yeah, the old
dance music.
The old hippies kind of with the dance music crew. Yeah. That was their little.
Yeah. And I knew the George Robey, and that's why I kind of had a bit of a, like I knew it was a place I wanted to go, because with the first band I was in, which was me and my three mates, borrowed some guitars, and my friend's parent was going out with one of Depeche Mode, so he had a few drum machines and things like that, and it was amazing. In our band, we played a few, pay-to-play gigs, because what people have to remember is, the gig circuit in London in the kind of 80s was awful, as in gigs, you basically have to pay 50 quid to put a gig on with yourself, and you would get paid back by the tickets on the door.
Yeah, Bull and Gate. Didn't Bull and Gate used to do that?
Yeah, and I played at the Bull and Gate many times.
Because exactly, they'd have like 5-6 bands on, wouldn't they, for that exact reason. And in one way, it's good business for them, because they're getting the money in, and then they're forcing you to try and get all your mates there, which you would do anyway, but then obviously they make money from the beers as well.
From the bar, So we were in a band that was sort of, I guess, hippie psychedelic band, and
what was the name?
So the first band had an enormously pretentious name based on a phrase that's in the Allen Ginsberg poem Howl. We were called Hydrogen Jukebox. What it meant, I have no idea.
I saw the best minds of my generation, starving, hysterical, naked. I used to be able to recite big, but it gets a bit boring after the first 10 lines.
Yeah. I don't think I even read the full poem. We just liked the words.
I think Allen Ginsberg's the only one who's ever read the whole poem. It's pages and pages and pages.
It's a big one, isn't it?
But the intro's good.
Yes, that really kind of gets into your mind. But yeah, so we called ourselves Hydrogen Jukebox, and we were guitar-y psychedelic. But that was like right at the start of being at sixth form, when we were still reluctantly getting into the dance music thing. And then that band kind of fizzled out, and we became another band, which was more with samplers and guitars. So we kind of merged it a little bit, and we were going to the places like the George Robey. And the Robey was great because it was like a free festival indoors, and it had a weird room that had, violinists playing kind of.
It was a big old pub, basically, wasn't it? It was a big old pub that had been there for years.
Yeah, Irish pub.
Yeah, kind of run down, but again, that's probably why Club Dog could get away with doing there. Put some lights on. There was loads of like them sort of. Yeah, I guess how I do remember it was like the UV backdrops, and then people did have the sort of psychedelic. I guess that was a thing as well. So this kind of hippie element of the psychedelic sort of backdrops that are in there.
That's it. Yeah, and in a way, sort of Acid House had borrowed from that sort of look and feel, the UV, the fluoro stuff, the light shows, and they had a proper light show at Club Dog, which was all liquid lights and Super 8 projectors and that kind of stuff. So it had all of that element to it, like the original happenings and stuff. And it was unpretentious, whereas, Alice in Wonderland was possibly a bit pretentious or a bit dressy and fashiony.
Yeah, it definitely was. It was a bit. I don't really like Alice in Wonderland so much. I didn't feel part of that scene. I remember I went a couple of times, but it wasn't. I was a bit like there was people just pouncing about. It was frilly shirts and crushed velvet.
Yeah, it was a kind of little bit more posery, whereas Club Dog was definitely not that.
No.
And Club Dog embraced dance music, and there was that was what was great about it, was that you could see funky psychedelic bands, the Ululalators, Osmic Tentacles, that type of thing. And then after the bands, and next door there'd be funny cabaret performances that, it was a little bit akin to the free festivals in some way. I never forget this guy, I think he was called Nick Black, who had a violin. He was about 6'5". He looked a bit like Nick Cave or something. And he would play a violin. He would do Jimi Hendrix style stuff through distortion pedals and wah-wah pedals. And it was like, I was like, yeah, this is amazing. And then the main room I think it was a DJ called Monkey Pilot or something like that. And I'll never forget, because you knew the rave was sort of coming on. I don't even know if it's quite called rave, yeah.
Was it Monkey Pilot played there? Because he was the guy, we've talked about him in some previous things. My friend Neil, I do another series, but we talked about him. He did the Whirly gig. He was a DJ at the Whirly gig, which I did go to in the midday. And yeah.
The Whirly gig was even the sort of more kind of clean version, wasn't it? It was a beautiful place.
Well, do you know what?
No alcohol there.
Again, I got taken there, and it was, you'd all had to go under the bloody parachute at the end.
Parachute.
And it was very hippie.
Yeah.
And I was a bit like, oh, fucking hell, I'm not sitting on the fucking parachute. And then, you know.
Yeah, it was, I mean, you know, I always prefer Club Dog, because it was kind of sort of, and you know, Club Dog, it was like whatever, it was like £2, £3 to get in or something, wasn't it? It was fantastically kind of accessible to most people.
Yeah, I mean, again, my memories of it, I literally, because it was right down the road from me, I went going in there, and I almost remember actually no one in there, and just lights and just chilling out there. But yeah, not some rammed up club. It was just...
No, I mean, because it was very close to where my sixth form was, literally 100 metres from us. It was, you know, we did our first gig in there as the band, and then we would go there, and I would often meet a few people from sixth form there, and then that became a kind of my crossover from the hippie thing into the rave thing, really. And famously for me, the moment where they would always put Stack a Humanoid on would be the moment that you knew the evening had properly started, because that was the one we were waiting for.
Yeah, well, that is, I mean, again, that's such an amazing tune. It still is one of the most fucking slamming records.
Absolutely kicking,
I still drag that out. You put that on and people still go mental.
Yeah, I mean, it's fail-safe, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's in the film as well, and it's one of those moments that everyone just suddenly knows.
There's an amazing clip. Have you seen it when it's on the Hitman and Her?
Well, no, I haven't.
And he introduces, Pete Walkman going, I won't try to do his accent, but he basically goes, yeah, but Stack a Humanoid. Yeah. And there's loads of darts and they bang that on, and it just says, I think it's like one of them where it might even have been the Jeremy Deller one where he talks about where they do the rave ones, and then suddenly you realise it's not Hitman and Her in anymore, and they're just going mental, and people are just really busted shapes to Stack a Humanoid. Like
eyeballs popping out. Yeah,
exactly.
Totally. They're suddenly out of their depth, you know, they don't know what they're doing. So that was a kind of a big shift for me, going to those. And then, like I say, around that area, there was quite a big sort of squatting scene. And we went to a few parties that were called low-life parties. And they were, I guess, in that little haven of squats, there was a sort of a warehouse, back of a warehouse.
Is that the ones that Bill Brewster does, or was that something else?
Yeah, I don't know. All I remember is going to a party and my friend saying, "Oh, it's a low-life party."
Okay.
And then afterwards thinking he was putting it down in some way. He was going, "Oh, it's full of lowlifes," but actually no, it was the brand. It was the name of the party. Yeah. And it was that bit when I think the kind of Manchester element was starting to kick in, because I remember one of the bands, whatever, that was playing, there was raving or house music, that kind of bit that I think where before breakbeats kicked in, it was there was the bleepy element of it, and then there was the kind of baggy Manchester element of it, LFO on the bleepy side, and then the kind of the remixes of all the sort of Manchestery stuff. And there was a live act, and they had a tape machine. I remember, like, the tape machine you got downstairs. Yeah. A two reel tape machine, and that was their backing track. And it was just a guy Manchestering in it on the little stage, and it was just a dugga sort of beat, and I loved it. I thought it was brilliant. So yeah, that was the kind of thing. And then after I finished my A levels, so that would have been June 1990, I went to Glastonbury for the first time, at the last Glastonbury that the Travellers were at.
I mean, obviously this is a big part of your film, isn't it? Should we set the scene just for what happened at that Glastonbury, or did you see all the carnage that happened?
To a certain extent. So I went legit, because it was our celebration of finishing my A levels, and I remember
you actually bought a ticket, did you?
I bought a ticket.
Oh my God! Yeah.
I think I've still got it somewhere. I think it was £24.
Oh, amazing! Yeah.
We bought a ticket because it was our celebration of finishing our A levels. We were excited to go and see Adamski and Happy Mondays, and didn't know anything at all that there was this other bit of the festival. For us, it was, we were going down there because there was all bands that we were kind of into, you know. Jesus Jones was still cool then, and I ended up playing with them years later, funnily enough. So Glastonbury to us was like the closest we could get to, you know, going to Woodstock, but it was a ticketed thing, and you know, it was easy to get tickets then. You just bought tickets,
it was still it was still a cool festival then. I feel like it hadn't been totally middle class out of existence.
Yeah, I mean, and it still to me felt quite wild and edgy, you know, as in it was like, kind of, clearly there were loads of people that hadn't bought a ticket there, and we went down in my mate Tristan's 2CV that he's got his 2CV from his parents, but I knew I had to make my own way back, I think, because he had someone else he was giving a lift back, so I always had that in the back of my head that I had to get down there with him, but then I had to make my own way back somehow.
Wow.
So
worry about that when it happens.
Exactly, yeah. So on the I remember the night before, I couldn't really sleep because it was my exam of the morning, and then that night we were going to go to Glastonbury. Or maybe it was, I was doing my exam, my last exam ever, A-level exam, because I was going to take a year off at least, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And then I was going to go to Glastonbury the next day. Fucked that exam up royally because I had terrible sleep. I also had really bad hay fever. And I just couldn't stop thinking that I was going to Glastonbury.
What was the exam? Do you remember?
It was my last drama one, and I think I got an F for it. Oh, so I would have got an A at drama, but I fucked that one up so badly. So in some ways, it didn't stop my going to college in the end. But I was just too excited, and I hadn't slept, and I had also quite bad hay fever. So I just bashed through this, went home. And then we went to Glastonbury, and I was just so extremely excited. I remember getting there, and at that point, you could kind of sort of camp almost sort of anywhere you liked. And somebody had said to us, who was on my same course, he said, "Oh, try and camp in the Kingsfield," which now is where the Stone Circle is. So we went right to the top, and there was already a lot of people there who'd obviously known to get there early, and we camped by this amazing old tree, which is still there, just next to where the Stone Circle became up, but it wasn't the Stone Circle yet, and you could camp right up there. And that was the field directly next to...
So they hadn't built the Stone Circle?
Stone Circle didn't arrive till 92.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the Stone Circle was actually brought in, because I knew that, because my friend Tristan's stonemason uncle was one of the stonemasons.
I didn't even realise they created their own Stone Circle.
It is an invented Stone Circle, and it was invented in 92, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
And there's an irony to that in some ways, because that was the year the travellers weren't allowed. So, yeah, we went and we got my classic orange, triangle tent right next to this old tree, which became a very good friend of mine that night later on. Saved my life in some way. And we had a brilliant Friday night, and we saw the Happy Mondays. They were sort of shambolic but really fun. But the highlight in a way was sort of watching Adamski, because it was like the music we'd been listening to. We were still on that hippie edge, but it was like...
He was really massive for a little bit, wasn't he? I remember liking Adamski and
Killer was the tune of 1990.
Yeah.
That summer, Killer was basically the tune, and he played like various versions of it. One where there was like a didgeridoo sound, and it was brilliant, and he, track NRG and stuff, and they were
that was the one I remember actually.
Yeah,
that was the one.
I'd bought the Live and Direct album, which I think was maybe it was recorded at the Hacienda or somewhere anyway. But it was so we loved all of that, and then on a Friday night we went off on a mad adventure, as you do, and stumbled around and stumbled across the path that led to the Travellers' Field, and I don't think I ended up in that tent, but I do remember being utterly freaked out and excited and exhilarated by 14-year-old, 15-year-old girls with a baby in their arm going, acid, trips for sale, and just my mind being blown, absolutely blown. And I bumped into somebody...
You're not in Kansas anymore.
Really not in Kansas anymore. And I bumped into somebody that I'd fell asleep in their squat in Camden after drinking too much tequila on Hampstead Heath once. And I bumped into them, and they'd gone all full traveller. and they were dreads and everything, and they were like, "Oh, what are you doing? Last time I saw you, you were passed out in our squat in Camden," and I was like, "Oh yeah," and and I'd been talking to them about Taoism and stuff like that before I passed out face down.
Serves you right then.
Yeah,
serves you right.
So I needed to,
exactly.
Shut up.
You needed to shut up. Yeah,
exactly.
Go face down, bro.
Nothing wrong with Taoism, by the way.
Oh no. Apologies to any Taoist.
I'm still a bit of a Taoist.
That's all right.
But so I'd just realised that there was this world epoch-changing thing going on at Glastonbury, and I remember just wandering and almost being too scared to kind of go too deep into it. It was just so mad, And I remember just walking up and down that railway line, and people it was clearly like the main line into an entirely different planet, And then I think the next day I woke up with a bit of a shocking kind of hangover back in my tent, and we went wandering around the festival again, and I saw some of it during the day, and there was clearly, there was loads going on. And there was
probably even more scary during the day when you can actually see all the...
Yeah, and I just remember a lot of traveller kids with mullets, and I remember thinking, these kids live in this mad, wild life, having a bit of respite watching the comedian and poet John Hegley in the comedy tent.
Oh, I used to love John Hegley.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Still love John Hegley, yeah.
Yeah.
I used to see him loads back in the day, yeah.
Amazing, and we were laughing because these traveller kids were trying to get on the stage, and they were, they used to have a puppet thing, like a little dog or something.
Yeah.
They were trying to punch his puppet, and he was going, "Get off, fuck off, get off."
Yeah.
And the dog was, having a conversation, a bit of an argument with this little traveller kid with sort of dreads.
Well, they were terrifying, some of the little traveller kids. They were always like proper little...
It was just... And I hadn't seen anything like that, and it was just a mind blower to me. And I remember bumping into my friend Hannah, and we were like, "Oh, wow, there's all these people with, selling acid," and we were like, "Whoa." And then I did a stupid thing I was with some friends who didn't like smoking, and I got some hash, and I was getting a bit bored rolling up and then nobody having it. And I was like, bollocks. So I just bit a bit of hash off. Rookie error, Glastonbury, biting a bit of hash off. Went to watch The Cure, and the whole sky had gone purple, and I was like, wow. And there's this weird moment that happened during the Cure set when the crowd had got so big, it sort of pushed forwards, and a girl had got quite badly squashed at the front of the gig, and it unnerved me a bit. It sort of sent me on a bit of a downer, and this helicopter had to come, and it moved the crowd back. Robert Smith was going, "Can you please move back? Please move back like this." I've since found a bit of footage of it, and everyone moved back, and the helicopter landed right in front of the pyramid stage and hoisted this girl off somewhere because she'd been quite badly squashed. And that put me on a bad one.
Oh, sure.
And I just went wandering off and staggered around, and again through all the kind of craziness of the fields, and ended up back at my tent on my own next to this oak tree, and all of my friends had gone to the bloody Travellers' Field, and they were dancing in the Tonka tent, little did I know, that night. And I ended up back at my oak tree and had a vision of myself as an old man chanting Celtic folk songs. And that brought me round as I was like on a real downer, and I just had this vision of myself as probably my age now, chanting Celtic folk songs. I've got this whole Welsh side of my family, so it's and it kind of made me feel like it's fine, you'll make it to being old. This is what it told me, weirdly, and I had that sort of feeling then, and then I eventually, after sat there in my tent listening.
One day you'll make a film about all this.
Yeah, and it was just, and I think something in that bit when my friends came back and they were like, "Oh, we were in this tent and there was a horse and there was all these people and we went up to space," and they'd obviously had a very psychedelic night in the Tonka tent or the pyramid. I don't know which one they were in, but my 3 or 4 friends who were with me, and I basically had this out-of-body experience becoming an old man. And so again, it was almost like a little bit of FOMO, I suppose, that there was something happening just that literally 50 metres away from me. What was that? And then that became the sort of summer when I came back to London and I got a job in a record shop, and I really got into dance music at that point.
What record shop? Yeah.
So I was working at an Our Price Records in Golders Green, and that was a kind of brilliant sort of time, so I met a friend there, Richard, who's now no longer with us, sadly, and he became like a new friend. He was in that sort of crusty punk techno element of things. And we started making music together, and we're making music with them. We got more into like the dance music side of it, going to Club Dog every week, going to see bands like The Shaman, who were again that kind of crossover. And it had seemed like the illegal rave side that happened in 88 and 89 had sort of finished. And I almost felt like we were a bit late, as in, where's all that gone, But we were going to, I guess, a lot of these like alternative, edgy kind of events like Club Dog. And then, that was sort of a good sort of 8 months, 9 months, and I became the curator of both the rave section, dance music section, and got really into collecting music and buying a lot of vinyl at the time. And I was also the curator of the ambient section. And so, of course, basically it was Brian Eno and Chill Out by the KLF.
That's all you need.
That's all you need for a post-party experience. And I bought I remember having What Time Is Love on back order for about a year because you couldn't get a hold of it. And I would, obviously being in a record shop, it meant that you could get first dibs on when the vinyl came in.
Well, yeah, our price did used to get some decent tunes in. Then. Like and obviously if people like you were buying the tunes in, if people are going out, you could get some quite decent tunes in our price.
Yeah, I mean, and it was always a struggle because I remember there was the George Michael album, there was the Madonna album, and there was the Four Tenors, and they were the albums that the bosses would tell you just put it on, when it's peak times, which would generally be first thing in the morning and a bit in the afternoon and evening. But the rest of the time, you could kind of put on what you wanted. And whenever it would go a bit quiet, me and my mate Richard would go, right, get this. We'd put LFO on, or we'd put, the Bass Breaks and Bleeps album when that came out.
Yeah, they were classic. Yeah, I've got all them.
And it was great because it was like discovering music. You'd get direct calls from the distributors. So Southern would call you up and go, "Oh, we got this new tune. It's the new da-da-da-da-da." And you'd get, the latest pressings of things, and you'd say, I'll take one, and you'd have it for yourself.
Yeah. Well, obviously they want to sell the records. They want to get them out there, So like.
Yeah, and it was very analog, But we had a kind of a green screen computer that was just a stock checking thing. But pretty much, and I think we'd get the stock in and we would put that it had arrived in, and then if it had sold that day, you would put that it had sold into the...
Well, Chris Dexter, he was going on about, when he worked somewhere, he was going on about MS-DOS.
Yeah.
And I was like, what are you talking about? And that's what he meant with the green screen, when you're searching the catalogue in HMV to find a tune. Like that was, the internet of its time or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think it was even connected to the internet. It was just a hardware thing, and I can't even remember how they stored the data. But but we were into all this music, and so that was, for me, was like really getting into house music, electronic music, dance music, as well as bands. I remember the first Nirvana record coming in and loving that, and I was still into guitar music, and the band we were in was this sort of combination of the two. So we kind of, did a lot of going to clubs, going to I suppose edgier events, and we were in this band, and all the way through the end of 19. I think I started in the record shop end of the summer 90, and I was there till June of 91. And again, fabulous FOMO creating. I'd then saved up enough money to go travelling, so I went to Eastern Europe with my friend, and we spent sort of 3.5, 4 months travelling around through the summer that became the summer of love of my film, of the free party thing, and I had no idea it was going on at all. And when we got back from travelling, we went to Turkey and Eastern Europe, and we were taking our demo tape around trying to get signed in Berlin and signed in Hungary, because we thought it'd be cool to be signed to a label in Budapest,
Sure.
And failed completely. But it was a kind of fun idea of a mission. Had a brilliant summer. And then I came back and I was going to go to university in Birmingham in September. And when I got back, what I remember was it felt like music had entirely changed from when I left. And it was only 3 months, 4 months maybe. And when I left, it was bass drums, 4 on the floor, and it was bleeps. And when I arrived back, the Prodigy Charlie was the tune of the moment.
Yeah, number one.
And it was like, what has happened to music? It's gone faster, it's gone madder, and it's this combination of the break beats and all of the pianos and everything thrown into one. What's this? And the Hoover sound. And it felt like a whole new genre of music had arrived during that summer. And then I went to college and fell in, I suppose, with a right crew of ravers. And basically we were going to raves every weekend.
I was going to say, that was the start of the rave, really, or what you call rave. Obviously they're always raves, but like...
It was definitely called rave when the Prodigy arrived, I think. That was what... I think before that, I don't even remember the point where it was called rave. I seem to remember a few records had rave in the title, you know, Rave New World, this, that and the other. And it just before I got to college, actually, funnily enough, and in fact, actually at sixth form, this must have been, I had spoken to Fraser Clark because I was doing an article on the Zippies, which he was a founder member of, for me and my mate's student zine that we'd made. And he happened to live about 100 metres from my mum. He lived just off West End Lane, and spent a day with him, and I stayed a bit in touch with him, and I saw again that hippie techno.
What was he like, Fraser Clark? 'Cause I don't know. I know his events, but I don't really know too much about him or who, what, you know.
Very lovely guy, you know, Scottish guy, very sort of comfortable in his own skin, smart.
Was he an old hippie from back in the day?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But, so he was probably in his 40s when I went around and interviewed him for the zine.
Well, that must have seemed like ancient, you know.
Yeah.
At that age.
Yeah, it was my mum's age.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so, so that was a little bit before I got to college, but he was, it was an interesting encounter. And in fact, I went and saw, there was an event that happened on Hampstead Heath that he made that I've since found footage of, interestingly, of like a kind of a hippie gathering type thing with some bongos, and of course the Hare Krishnas turned up, and you know, then a few people with a little sound system, you know.
If there's bongos, the Hare Krishnas will be there. Yeah.
It's true, yeah. But you always got a free meal, you know. If the Krishnas were there.
But what is it? It's bloody tasteless dull. Yeah. But,
this is true.
You know,
you'll take it though.
You'll take it though. To be honest, yeah. If you're at a festival and you haven't eaten for a few days, I've had plenty of meals where I'm like, yeah, it tastes amazing. Yeah.
So I think it was that's how they got you in the tent. It was.
Well, I do remember they I don't know if they still got it. There's a place in Soho Square.
Fabulous place.
And you could go in there and get a free meal.
Yeah.
And obviously it was the same sort of thing. Get you in there and they try and sell you the little book, give you like the free.
Read a few leaflets.
And. Do you want
to come upstairs?
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's all right. I'll just have my tasteless dull for nothing, and then
actually the food there's pretty good now. If you've ever
is it? Well, all right.
Yeah.
Well, they probably have up their game because it did used to be just like some boiled lentils, and that was about it. Not even many spices.
Yeah, sort of squat slop. You know, it was.
I mean, and fair enough. They were doling it out for free.
Yeah, so. Fabulous. Yeah, no, and I suppose that comes from the free festival era in some ways. Is that they would always be there at free festivals, and it was often a place of like, oh, let's just go and crash out at the. As far as I know,
No, exactly, yeah.
And they were at Glastonbury the first time I went, and it was like, go and get a free bowl of dal and crash out in the corner for an hour or two, and they won't kick you out. You know, you'll be fine. You can go and sit and have a kip and sober up a bit. So I went to Birmingham University, and I fell in with a big rave crowd there, and that was winter '91 to the spring '92. And we really went, we became quite a large kind of bunch of us, all living, some on campus, some off campus, but on the in the sort of self-catering flat blocks. And we just became, we were raving Friday, Saturday, come down day on Sunday, maybe go to a couple of lectures.
I was going to say, did you manage to do any work?
Yeah, a little bit. I did okay because I was doing drama, and it was a bit more drama, and it was like drama and media course sort of thing. So I had to do a little bit.
Yeah.
I did nearly mess it up completely when I went to Glastonbury '92, which was the after the fallow year, which I didn't have a ticket to go to, and I was falling out. I was kind of at the tail end of a relationship I'd been having at college. And we'd done a lot of partying. That whole kind of lead up to that was really like, it was like a come down really. And of course, during that time, Castlemorton had happened, and it was this sort of big event, and most of my mates had gone, and I'd been stupid enough to go to say to somebody, No, I don't need it. Come on, we're going to this site rave. No, I got no money. And I literally was skinned. I knew I wanted, it was the bank holiday weekend, and I was going to go back home because my mum worked for British Rail at the time and I had free train travel. So I could get on a train and I could get back to London, feed myself for the first time in 4 months and do some washing. And of course, I had this terrible night when it was only me and my friend Kenan, who was a gay guy, and he was trying to pull, and so everyone else went to a site rave. We had no idea where they were going. I was left with Kenan, and he said, "Oh, come on out, I'll take you out." But he was going to take me and use me as a sort of foil to pull. And of course, I was sat there like emaciated, 9 stone, hadn't really eaten for 4 months because we'd just been raving hard, going to parties, and then this night was like probably the worst kind of night I can imagine. And he failed to pull. I was just sat there awkward the whole night. And the next day I went back to London, and I got there. My mum said, "What are you doing here? I thought you'd be at that." And on the news was one of my mates who was from the little strip of houses in Kingsgate Road that we were at, and there she was, sat there with a beer in her hand and a spliff on the news. And I thought, oh my God, I've missed the Woodstock of our time, and I just could not believe it. Could not believe it.
I mean, I got back from America like a week after that, and like I'd been doing raves out in the States.
Yeah.
But then come back a week after, my sister, she was like, "Oh, yeah, we went to this amazing party last weekend, Castlemorton." So I missed it by a week as well. But I was having fun in the States. I was doing stuff over there, but
So I mean, what I probably should have said a bit earlier is, as well as all the raving we were doing in Birmingham, which was a lot, we would go out to parties in the fields around Birmingham as well. I think we must have gone to at least 2 or 3 DIY parties, but I had no idea where they were. They were just, it's just a party somewhere in a field. You'd go, there'd be a marquee, and you'd dance.
Well, a lot of times you wouldn't know, would you?
No.
You just end up going there because someone go, "Let's go here," and then...
I didn't have a car, so I was always in the back of my mate's
I mean, again,
car.
you wouldn't know who the DJs were, who was playing music or anything. You wouldn't really give a shit,
no idea.
to be honest.
It's just a free party in a field somewhere. I didn't even think they were called free parties. My friend would call them site raves. That was the term that he used. But I had that previous winter, so the 91 to 92, I had, when I came back to London, gone to the Roundhouse. And obviously we talked a bit
This
about...
wasn't to a poetry reading or Gilbert and Sullivan, was it? No.
No. So when I came back to see all my sixth form friends and my friends who'd been away at college, or some of them had been still living in London, on Christmas Eve we went to the World's End in Camden and just had some beers.
91, wasn't it?
91. I went with my friend Tara, who was dressed as a Christmas tree, and we were having this kind of like banter about whether the Christmas spirit was a real thing or not. And she was like, "Of course it is, I can feel it in the air." And I was being a cynic going, no, it's all made up, it's just bollocks,
Such a Grinch.
Totally a bit of a Grinch. And then we were walking back from the World's End, and I remember somebody coming up to me at the World's End and giving me a flyer. And on that flyer, it said something about a party at the Roundhouse. And it didn't, 2 and 2 did not kind of make 4 at that point, because I just thought, but it was a little kind of handmade little flyer. While we were at the World's End, this was, in the pub.
Did it have a logo on? You don't remember it?
I can't remember anything about the flyer other than it said something about a party at the Roundhouse. So that would be the way we'd walk home anyway, go back to get the 31 bus or the 28 bus, can't remember which one. But that would take me back to where my mum was in West Hampstead, Kilburn. And so we walked back past the Roundhouse, and sure enough, there was a queue of people and buses outside the Roundhouse. And, we were a bit pissed, and I think we might have had a tiny bit of acid, I seem to remember, because everything was a little bit sparkly. It was quite Christmassy. So... particularly extra.
Your mate was wearing a dress like a Christmas tree. So,
she was bringing the Christmas spirit.
Sure she was doing that? Yeah.
She definitely was. And we were with a couple of other friends, and so we went in, and we probably only stayed for about half an hour or an hour, because it was a big cavernous space, and there was a little sound system in the middle, and there was maybe 200 people. 300 people. Maybe. We were like, oh right, there's a little rave in here. And we danced around a bit, and we had a bit of a bop, but there was no real like. It didn't feel like a vibe because it was a bit sort of stark. The lights were up.
The Roundhouse is massive, isn't it?
It's huge.
I mean, basically, because it was like an old, what was it, railway maintenance yard or something?
Yeah, I think they used to bring the locomotives in and they would fix them.
I think they bring the trains in, and the whole point was they could rotate them, I think.
Yeah.
Wasn't it something like that? So it was this massive industrial Victorian
So it's big enough to fit an entire locomotive engine in, bring it in, turn it and clean it and fix it underneath and then take it back out again onto the railway, which it was obviously next to. So we had a night and it felt magical because it was like, I'm in the Roundhouse and I used to come here and I was on that little stage but we didn't really get into the rave, as in, it was like, it felt a bit like, also, it was Christmas Eve, and I was, I knew in the morning I was going to be having Christmas dinner with my mum. So we stuck around for a little bit, for an hour or so. But it was like, oh, that was mad, wasn't it? It was mad. It was a little rave in the Roundhouse, and then I remember the next morning. I don't think I slept much because of this tiny little bit of acid. I remember having a really nice Christmas day with my mum and having a ginger wine at 11 o'clock in the morning and thinking, this is brilliant. What a good Christmas day, and me and my mum got on quite well anyway, and it didn't matter that I'd barely slept and that I'd imbibed a little bit the night before. Anyway, cut to about a week or so later, as things go. What are you going to do for Christmas, for New Year's Eve? Well, who knows? Well, we did our usual thing. Let's just go to Camden and we'll see what's going on. And of course, we get into Camden and go do the usual few pubs. There was a pub called the Monarch and there was a pub called the World's End, and we'd do the little tour. And of course, we saw that there was a fucking great big queue outside of the Roundhouse. So we'd gone to a couple of the pubs, and there was a bit more of a crew of us this time. And we queued to try and get in to the Roundhouse, but it was a bit more edgy, and there was a lot more people. And I remember feeling like, this is going to be amazing. When we're going to get in there, this is going to be the party to end all parties. And people started to say, as we were in the queue, that it was Spiral Tribe that were doing this party. And I'd heard about them because I was kind of in West Hampstead, and you'd see the stickers everywhere. And in fact, I think they'd even popped up in the music press a little bit, as in Spiral Tribe doing these illegal parties, following the Melody Maker and that type of thing. I think somehow I'd read about them a little bit.
Had they put their record out? Yeah.
This was before the record.
Oh yeah, okay, all right.
So, and now obviously I've done the film. I know more about the sort of the kind of story. They had at this point been on Jonathan Ross. I didn't see that at the time. Obviously, there's a very funny clip of it in the film.
It's an amazing clip with Mark and Aztec, isn't it?
Mark and Aztec, and they're obviously post come down. About a month before the party at the Roundhouse, and there's a very funny exchange with them talking about how they're doing it for sort of squatters' rights and stuff, but they're clearly probably on a massive come down at the same time, and Jonathan Ross is quite playful with them and funny. He makes a good joke. But I hadn't seen any of that. But I had heard of Spiral Tribe. I'd seen these stickers around, and they had added an element of mystery because they were black and white stickers. They were near my mum's house, and they were everywhere. And apparently, it turns out later on, they were living very close by. And so I heard it was Spiral Tribe, and we tried to get in. And I think somebody was trying to charge us on the door, but we kind of got in anyway. And don't think we paid. They were trying to charge a $5, but it was all so chaotic and messy. But there was loads and loads of people, and I remember, this guy outside who I'd known at school, a big scary guy, who was going, "Oh, you're here? Yeah, I remember you. Do you know where I could get any acid?" And I was like, "No." But he, previously he'd be somebody I'd be terrified at school, and he was at this rave going to this, trying to get in. But there was also that whole squat punk traveller element as well. Big buses everywhere, dogs on strings, the works, that I was used to from the whole Robey kind of thing. People kind of trying to scrounge their way into a £3 party, But I loved all of that sort of, element. It was just like, wow, £3. But we managed to get in. I don't even think we paid. And I was with my friend Tara and another friend, Gillian, and a couple of other friends. And we'd obviously been in Birmingham going to big raves, like the places called the Custard Factory and the Institute, places like that were, you know, Fabio and Groove Rider, you know, all the big DJs of the day who would play at all of the biggest events, you know, all the production value, big smoke, you know, and suddenly we were going into that. We were expecting that, you know, we were expecting, and we got in and someone said, oh, Hawkwind are going to play. And I was like, what? Hawkwind are going to play? And I couldn't get it.
You've entered some weird time portal back to the early 70s.
And we got in there and I was like, Hawkwind are going to play in it. And there was some sort of band in the distance trying to kind of get some numbers together, but the sound kept going. And so we were just like, what is this? This isn't a rave at all. We'd been kind of come from being all these big colourful ones. And I remember this cheesy quaver coming up to us going, oh, you lot, are you ravers? And we went, yeah. And he went, are you hardcore ravers? And we went, yeah. And he went, well, what's all this fucking for shit then? And we just, and it stayed in our mind of like, yeah, we've kind of gone into another world, you know. But, you know, I was quite comfortable with that scene anyway, because it had sort of been where we'd come from.
Well, I think that's why I didn't trust the hippies, you know what I mean? I was still worried that shit was going to go happen.
Yeah.
All right.
But it was a, like you say, it was
do you know
a bit like
do you know if it was Hawkwind or?
So since then, I've obviously discovered that Hawkwind were meant to play, but they never arrived. Right. But 2000 DS, 2000 Dirty Squatters, did try and play, and actually there is video film of it, which we've got, and which did form part of some of the footage for my film, but is also going to play some role in the Dirty Squatters film.
I want to see that, yeah.
And it was largely, I think, maybe not even on the New Year's Eve, but a bit earlier. So I think they were the band on stage, but I can't be sure. But there was definitely a band as we walked in at about, you know, 20 to midnight on the 91 kind of New Year's Eve. And then we got in, and of course it was just sort of chaos and carnage. And I bumped into, I mean, because it's Camden, I bumped into so many people that I knew, and we were having a laugh. We were all, you know, we'd had some acid and we were running around drinking, and it was kind of just chaos. And the sound system would come on for about half an hour. We'd be like, yeah, we'd be like, everybody would be really excited. Come on, the music would kick in and we'd be like, brilliant. And it would go again. And it was kind of too quiet. And so we'd get close to the sound system, and then that would be the place where there'd be people frantically trying to put stuff together.
I know they had big problems with the sound that night, didn't they? Kept going
huge
off.
Power problems,
The power was going.
Yeah.
Was it plunging into darkness, or could you see, or like?
It was extremely dark in there anyway. There was just a few, I guess, I seem to remember there being lasers or strobes or something, and there wasn't much else that I could really make out. And of course when the power goes and it's like it's been strobes and now there's nothing, it was quite edgy, you know. But we kind of enjoyed the edginess, and I seem to remember me and Tara were hanging out, and our other friend Gillian, and we were trying to dance, and we bumped into somebody that we mutually knew from the kind of Kilburn kind of, you know, squatty kind of kids that were, you know, sort of housing co-op kids. And he was like, oh, I remember you. And I was like, yeah. And there's a picture of me and him getting out of a swimming pool in 1972 with both of us, you know, just there with a lollipop. And this is the next time I've met him, you know. And it was like, you! And it was like, you! And he then, turns out he used to go out with Tara. And so it was one of these things like, wow, we're really in the middle of a kind of maelstrom of Camden, Kilburn, and all of this countercultural kind of madness and this history. And me having been on the stage. And we had a real fun night, but it did feel on the border of sort of chaos.
Well, the podcast I did with Ben, Dead Silence, like he talked about him and his mate Glenn, and I think his mate Glenn went off, and like Glenn's quite a hard sort of guy, but I think he got mugged, he got robbed.
Yeah, there was.
And I know there was a lot of people mugging and robbing in that venue.
Yeah.
And Ben talks about going out and one bit outside, and all the security outside are just bashing people on the heads with them giant torches that all security guards seem to sort of carry, because they're good weapons and they can say that it's a torch. Yeah. But like they saw a lot of stuff. So
yeah, I mean, it became one of those events because I remember our friends they'd explored all the catacombs and everything, because it's got an incredible underbelly, that now is all done up as studios and things, but at the time it had been used as a few Doctor Who sets occasionally, but it was effectively abandoned, and there were just travellers living down there, from what I now know as Circus Normal. And
it is that sort of place back in the day. It was like,
wow.
Like you said, you can imagine like some weird tribe coming out from the catacombs have been down there.
Absolutely,
50 years or something.
For 100 years since the Victorian times when it was built. It was like going into a time portal or another world, and there's something about it being round and you don't know where the fuck you are and where's the back and where's the front, and it was a real moment of sort of confusion. But
well, we talked about London, like the venues being like bombed out and all that. So the same thing. There's all them places like that. Like you said, that God knows when they built the Roundhouse, but was it Victorian or like did it go back that far?
Yeah, I think it's something like 1850 something.
Oh my God, because it is like just mad old brick, incredibly. I'm sure it was an amazing feat to build the Roundhouse.
Absolutely,
and what it had to do with them trains was some work of engineering magic to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, the Victorians had a definite kind of skill with building, and they created a magical place without realising it. That it was going to be what it was going to be used for afterwards.
Tapped into the ley lines of future culture.
This is it, and a lot of people say that Primrose Hill is quite a magical place, and not on that kind of world. As in, there's a William Blake connection there, and the Druids, and it's direct line of sight. So there's a lot of that.
William Blake, South London, Peckham Rye.
Yes,
that's where you saw his visions.
That's very true. Yeah, absolutely.
Get my South London bit in there.
Yeah.
All right. So you're back at the Roundhouse. So were you there like all night, and did you stay much during the following day, or
we weren't there? We weren't there till it became light. We probably left, I would say, 4 or something in the morning. Yeah. Friends of ours wandered around the catacombs and would just be like, "This is shit," and left. And we stayed and had just a mad adventure. And we did see, people, they had a bonfire in the middle of the dance floor because there was no light. Some travellers just set up a bonfire, just created a bonfire. So we were all standing around a bonfire in the middle of the Roundhouse. I seem to remember having a really fun, mad adventure. Yeah. Not a rave at all, actually, because the rave just didn't really happen. But since then, it became a kind of legend, as in I met so many people over the years said, "Oh, you were at the Roundhouse," and they'd either had the best night of their life or the worst night of their life. And in fact, some people said to me, "Oh, that was one of my lowest moments," and then other people said, "That was fucking amazing." And I've read articles of people who said, it was a real catalyst for so many things in their life. So it was clearly a moment of some sort of chaos magic unfolding in the chaos in the good way, if you like, or the chaos in the wild and dangerous way too.
I guess what I say about the free parties is, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, it's like one of the beauties of the free parties is that anything goes and blah blah blah. It's this free space, and you can get fucked up, you can do this and that, and that's great when it's all working. Yeah. But when then obviously if something's going wrong, if someone falls off a massive, ledge, or people robbing people. Yeah, that's where not having a secure environment in a normal sort of way. Yeah, and that's where either the festival, because obviously like festivals, there's a certain amount of policing that goes on. Obviously, if there's someone going around mugging, say at Glastonbury in the sites, I'm pretty more the site crew would sort them people out, wouldn't they? Yeah. Pretty brutally, shall we?
There was definitely a sense of having a kind of an informal security that would be people would be fucked off site
exactly
if they were for example selling heroin or if there was mugging going on, and that was something
hassling
that
women, being sort of
absolutely
that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that did happen at the free festivals. A lot of people told me that when I was making the film, there was definitely a certain kind of self-policing thing happening, and at Castlemorton itself, which it's mentioned in the film that there was muggers going around, and there was a certain degree of site justice that dealt with them in a way that possibly would seem quite alarming, but then what do? You let it happen, but you don't want police on site. So it's
for sure. I mean, I have seen that go on, but to people who deserved it, but that's a whole other thing. All right, so in your film, I think that's some of the Spirals say that, don't they? That it's one of the worst nights of their lives, and that's where they sort of thought that maybe,
I think the film covers it in a way is that in a way Spirals had kind of got quite big and popular at that point, and choosing a spot, however by happenstance or accident, like the Roundhouse, which is literally the centre of partying for young people, as I was an example of, in an urban environment, but also quite a dangerous urban environment, as in it's like you say, it's not a field. So with fields, you can kind of run off. I guess in a way,
that's what I mean about the health and safety and like.
Yeah, and I think they were quite responsible. It wasn't just let's just fuck up a place and fuck off. As in they wanted them to go well. They wanted people to have a good time.
Yeah.
But it was very big, and I think the power going meant that if there's a focus, the music's on, people are having a party. That's one thing. Yeah, you still might get some edgy things happening on the peripheries because it's a big, scary place. But if the power's off, I think it was almost at the point of going horribly wrong. But they did bring the power back at about.
So what was it? Loads of
morning.
Generators just running out, or do we know what it was? Or like,
I'm sure there is somebody who knows the exact technical reason why it all went off. But effectively, they couldn't draw enough power from their power source, and in the end, they had to apparently tap into the railway pylons that were literally next to it too.
Well, that's what I was wondering, if some of that happened, because obviously that's a whole other issue of...
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt, they did make the party happen eventually, and apparently, I wasn't there, but apparently from, 5 or so in the morning when the power came on, the ravers were given their full...
Was it just Spiral Tribe there? Who else was it?
So they were, at that point, kind of joined up a little bit with Circus Normal, who were a traveller crew, and were very known, I think, in the kind of Stonehenge era for putting on gigs, and then they kind of bled into a bit more the party side of it because they had a massive, great.
So that might have been why Hawkwind were meant to be playing.
Yeah, and the story goes, and it's not completely covered in the film. The story goes that Circus Normal were going to do the gig bit, hence Hawkwind and 2000 DS and that kind of thing, and then the Spirals would do the rave bit. But of course, apparently the sound man of Circus Normal got blood poisoning from some sort of reason or another. We can only speculate. And from that point on, nobody quite knew the kit because a bit earlier in the week. So goes the full story, and I'd love to flesh out all the story in some ways. Apparently, Mark from Spiral Tribe said that him and Zander noticed that all of their amps had been nicked, and so all the stuff that was at the Roundhouse was sort of Circus Normal's stuff. So a lot of people didn't really know it, apart from the sound guy, who had to go to hospital. So I think it was a confluence of disasters waiting to happen.
I mean, I guess that's the thing sometimes.
And being so big, so big.
Yeah.
In a quite crazy place.
Do you know what? I've just had a little memory because that's when I was in America, and I remember we did a New Year's Eve party in Pittsburgh, and we did this. We called it a New Year schizophrenic psycho rave, and we were, and basically because we had this live broadcast of Grateful Dead playing from San Francisco.
Right.
So and then upstairs we had like a rave.
So that's kind of like the Hawkwind and...
So that's kind of weird. So we were doing that, and because I remember we put all these posters and flyers up around Pittsburgh, the schizophrenic New Year psycho rave, and we got loads of complaints from the Schizophrenic Society of America, which
right.
I realise in hindsight using them terms was a bit not.
Where there wasn't so much of an awareness of sort of mental health being...
No, we were just... But the whole point was we had this party where half of it... Because again, you had that sort of crowd who were the old hippies who were into the... Even the young hippies who were into the Grateful Dead, and we were trying to do raves there.
Yeah.
So, that's just a little random memory. That's exactly... It was 91 to 92.
Yeah, exactly that.
I remember going in that.
So there was parallel attempted event, I think, happening in Camden.
Okay, anyway, that's just random. I remember that.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, it was one of those things that always obviously stuck with me. And you know, years later, I thought I'll make a short film about that. When I started making films, I thought I've got to make a short film about that. And it was going to be almost like sort of an experiment to see what people could really remember in an environment that there was no photographs, there was no sort of recordings of. And since then, I have found the odd still photograph and a variety of tiny little records of the whole thing, and obviously this footage from Dirty Squatters, because they were filming a lot of their own stuff.
It's interesting, like you said, that obviously, like you said, some people remember it with disdain and horror, and others, like yourself, had a lovely night.
And it was an adventure. It was a chaotic adventure, you know.
Yeah.
But and that was going to be the drive behind the short film was, you know, same place, same time.
All these different stories.
20,000 different stories.
Exactly, all these stories going on. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the original idea behind a short story. But then when I did start to interview people, I kind of realised there was this other bit, the lead up to Castlemorton, which obviously I mentioned. I have my own FOMO about missing, like you do, coming back a week later, and I was at the wrong place in the wrong time, even though all my mates were there. So,
but it wasn't the only rave, you know.
No, not at all.
I will say that. I mean, as much as like, it's the most legendary one from that era.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of parties going on.
Absolutely. And I mean, and funnily enough, that sort of summer, the summer of '92, a lot of the time I remember trying to find parties and them being busted. So pretty much that summer, because I was back in London again after finishing college, I had this insane trip to Glastonbury, which we could go into, but it's a bit of a story as well. That summer, I remember friends from college who had cars coming to London and us doing all the driving around the M25, trying to find this one driver, and largely never finding them, or they've been busted, or they've been moved, because that was that summer where all of the free events were suddenly not going to happen anymore because of Castlemorton, I think, because the police were suddenly like, they'd found their excuse to do the laws in different ways. They'd learned the skills of roadblocks. They'd learned about listening to the pirate radio. They'd learned how to make sure they were never going to have a thing like that again.
Well, there's the brilliant bit in your film as well, as you show when like the police are literally in, you know, is it from Gloucestershire? And they basically like get the fuck out of Gloucestershire.
Yeah.
But they're literally like giving people an escort into
Worcester, yeah.
And it's like, all right, you know, I'm sure the Worcester police are like, what the fuck? They must...
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, you know, I think that's partly a legacy of the fact that for many years the travelling festivals had usually been based in the West Country, and the Avon and Somerset police were just sort of sick of it because there'd been a run of events at places like Lechlade in the weeks preceding. And they didn't want the annual Avon Free Festival, which had been at Chipping Sodbury the year before, and I think it was at Ingleston Common the year before that. And, you know, for the previous good decade or so, it had been largely in the Avon area, Avon Free Festival. And the police were probably, you know, sick of not having enough of a force to stop it happening, being, you know, called out at their weekends when they were trying to do what they were doing. And they colluded, I would say, to just make sure it didn't happen on their patch, because there was this two forces, one of which was travellers and ravers desperate for potentially the biggest party ever to happen in May 1992, end of May bank holiday. Fantastic weather just happened that weekend. And the Avon police, who were sort of knackered and had it up to there at that point. And so, and maybe at that point they didn't have the sophistication of, you know, cross-border information. And they were probably just a bit like, well, just as long as they're off our patch, we don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what they helped to happen.
You can kind of understand that in a lot of ways.
Yeah. sick of it, and I think generally Chipping Sodbury the year before had been about 3,000 people maybe, and this year it was clearly going to be a great deal bigger because Lechlade had already been about 10,000 people, and the bank holiday at the end of May, the weather was so much better, and the appetite, the music had got to the point where it was like, what started, I suppose, the previous summer, huge acts like The Prodigy suddenly becoming mainstream and overground. It wasn't an underground thing anymore. It was a huge thing.
Well, what I say is my sister and her mates who went to it, like I said, the week before I come back, they're all from like South East London, Abbey Wood.
Yeah.
They're all sort of like London kids. They're not part of the traveller crew.
No.
They're not going to go to be honest, they're probably not going to go to some hippie festival in the West Country.
No.
But they all drove to, because it was like it was a rave out, and as you show on the film, like obviously when the news is just saying like this, this is there's a party with thousands of people, in this place.
Please stay away.
Please stay away. There's people doing drugs and dancing to music, and like they're staying up all night.
It's the bank holiday weekend.
It's a bank holiday weekend. Why don't you stay at home and
and watch it on TV like I did,
like you did? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And now I've been watching it on TV.
But that's what I'm saying. But they were the urban kids who went there. If you know what I mean. So maybe that kind of was the. Well, I'm not saying it was the bit, but it was partly the city.
Yeah.
Kids going out to the countryside, merging with all the. Which.
Well, obviously my friends, because we were in Birmingham, getting to Malvern, which was actually not that far. It's about an hour drive. So all my mates going to we're going to a sight rave. They didn't tell me they were going to the biggest one ever.
Yeah.
I didn't, and they didn't know, and they spent the weekend there and had an absolute laugh, and they were back on Tuesday to college, So everybody who heard about it and had access to transport and who was of a certain age, apart from me, was going to head that way. That's what you were going to do that weekend. And I just found out too late, because I found out on the Saturday afternoon and I was already in London, and I was like, oh my God. And all my mates were already there, people with cars. That's what kind of I remember is, the raver car was, you've got 6 mates in the back of a Ford Fiesta, but you've got to have that mate who's got a car, because he's the person, she's the person who's going to get you to the service station, who's going to call the thing. That was your access point.
I think my sister did have a full Fiesta then. I don't know if she drove it now.
Yeah, I mean that was the classic, because it was cheap, and you could get one for 500 quid, and they were fairly reliable, and you could get around with them, and then you could run them for ages. My friend had a white Ford Fiesta, and it was I think that was your access point. Was like somebody knew the vehicle, great, you're off, and you're going to have the party of your life, or maybe it won't be great, but you'll get to the biggest one ever, So I think not only was, like you say, was it that the traveller convoy element that had been hugely bloated by the raver traveller element. So the Spirals had really joined that bus, that train, if you like, the year before, and then there was newer crews like Bedlam who'd gone fully on the road, the preceding months, and huge amounts of sound systems suddenly are appearing who were all on that same tip of like, let's get a truck, let's get a sound system. So Adrenaline, who used to have something to do with Spiral Tribe, and then there was the Circus Warp tent, and they had Sweat sound system, and there was a much from the previous summer. The appetite was there, and the infrastructure was there, and the
music was there,
and the music was at its peak. That incredible blend of the kind of techno sound with the what would have become, I suppose, jungle and hardcore.
Early hardcore, like I said, bleeps going into break beats, bass
with
lines.
the ragga kind of samples, and
I think I said to you before that partly that's like there was loads of clubs playing that as well. So like I said, that's why like the kids from the cities wanted to go out to them parties, because they were playing the music that you could go and hear in like clubs,
Heaven and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Rage.
Yeah, exactly. Rage, places like that. tunes that you could hear, and it's like, why not go and hear that out in the countryside? Like I said, they wouldn't be going out there to check out Hawkwind, unfortunately.
No.
You know.
And I think that's the thing. Most of the ravers that went there had no idea that it was the Avon Free Festival. They just knew that it was a massive rave, and that the Spiral Tribe were going to be there, and Spiral Tribe had become quite a name at that point. And there's a little bit of footage in the film from Touchdown FM, and I knew Touchdown because it was the radio station that we used to listen to, and I think they were sort of based northwest London as well. Nobody knows, but we think they were somewhere up the road because we used to get a great reception at home listening to Touchdown. And there's a great clip that somebody had posted, which has literally got the DJ saying, you know, head down to Castlemorton Common, and he's got Energy Flash playing in the background. And it was just gold to find that, because he literally says, Circus Warp, Circus Normal, Bedlam, all the Bedlam crew, it's totally free, totally hardcore. And it's like, if anything sums up that moment in time, you know, it's that. For urban ravers like me and, you know, other people listening to Touchdown.
Again, one of the regular touchstones on this podcast is the power, you know, the power of pirate radio for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of the urban kids, I keep on saying in London, but I know it's not just London.
Oh, everywhere, yeah.
But with the pirates as well, because there's so many pirates in London, that's why they were into the music. You know, they knew all the tunes. So suddenly being able to find out that this is party outside London.
Yeah.
And a lot of people listened to the pirate radio.
Absolutely.
They had like a wide reach, you know.
Yeah. It was your connection to the underground. You know, it was because you weren't going to read about it in the paper. Although, of course, with Castlemorton,
although probably Daily Mail, we could guide how to get there.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think this was the fabulous way in which, you know, some people have got a belief that somehow it was hyped on purpose to create a boogeyman, to create an opportunity for the laws to change. And I think maybe, we don't know, but certainly it was an opportunity for the press to point the finger and say, look at these, you know, sort of scrounging dole travellers, but also all these terrible noise-making ravers and polluting ravers. So they certainly did that, but in some ways, at least in the short term, it backfired because it amplified the whole thing vastly. And then, you know, as we know, the rest is sort of history and is in the film that it went on for a week and was largely the excuse that was there to both create the new laws of the Criminal Justice Bill later, but also they arrested Spiral Tribe, and I think they were targeted partly because they had been sort of, their head had slightly come above the parapet, as in they were on Jonathan Ross. They had thrown these huge parties in places like the Roundhouse, and they were also the crew that got, you know, quite badly beaten up and stuff at Acton Lane.
Yeah, we didn't really mention Acton. Yeah, but that was the one after, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was before Castlemorton. So Spirals were obviously during the winter seasons they were doing warehouse parties, and Acton, they'd done a party I think the week before, somewhere around Easter.
So this was after the Roundhouse, but
before Castlemorton.
Yeah,
and in some ways I think that it was the sign that the police had fully had enough, and that rather than, whereas at previous parties they might turn up and say, turn the bloody noise down, or we're going to come in and we're going to, you know, do it ourselves. This time, for whatever reason, and it is an uncanny thing that John Major had just been voted back in about a week before. So I don't know whether he felt emboldened or whether there's any connection. I've got no way to prove that. But the John Major had been re-elected surprisingly because everybody thought Neil Kinnock was going to be...
well, again, I was in the States and like pre-internet, I remember going to sleep and all the American newspapers were like, Labour has won the election.
Yeah.
I woke up in the morning and it was like because I was, I'd only really known Tories through my life. And then I woke up in the morning and just heard on some like radio, it's really hard to find the information. Oh yeah, John Major, the Tories one. I was like, what the fuck?
What happened there?
What happened there?
So it was a big surprise, but he had a very reduced majority, down to about 20 seats or something like that. And he chose fairly quickly over the sort of following 6 months or so to target ravers, squatters and travellers as a wedge issue, to appeal to his right-wing base, to create a them and us situation.
He even mentioned them by name though, didn't he?
Yeah.
It wasn't even like didn't he even say travellers?
Oh, it's in the film twice. He said New Age travellers, not in this age, not in any age.
It is really monotone.
Yeah, which if you replaced that phrase with any other minority, it would be fascistic, right? As if you said gypsies, or if you said black people, if you replace any other minority, you're basically sort of saying we're going to wipe you out to a minority. So it is quite shocking hearing that now, especially from somebody who's seen as so benign as John Major.
Well, he was always maybe not nice, but he was more seen as the boring, but sort of the boring Tory, shall we say?
The boring Tory, but because his majority was so low, and the right wing of his party was the Eurosceptics, which we know how that went. There was a sense that he had to appeal to his base to shore up his support, because effectively 20, 30, 40 MPs deciding they didn't like him, and there was maybe 30, 40 MPs who were very anti his wanting to connect with Europe with the Maastricht Treaty and all of this. He decided to distract to a certain extent and choose a common enemy that Middle England could all get behind, which was squatters, ravers and travellers. And that's what he did. And I'm not sure if Acton Lane was a direct result of that, but certainly the police force, which was quite a shady kind of group called the Tactical Support Group, who had been involved in they were sort of established, I think, around the miners' strike to break up flying pickets, etc. And they were really a paramilitary police force. They were utilised at Acton Lane to basically not arrest everybody, as in you've broken laws, you're going to go to jail, but to just give them a pasting and smash all the kit up and warn them effectively, you fucking do this again and you're going to get more of the same. So it was a really sinister moment because, some people said, I've heard a strange mix of people saying, well, Spiral Tribe were kind of above, putting themselves above the parapet, but I think they'd got a target on their back and they were kind of more noticeable because they had a bit of an identity, they had a bit of a look, they had a shaved head, and that gave a target to the powers that be.
Sure. Yeah,
and they chose that party to basically just inflict some violence on them.
Was it just that tactical support group that went in, or?
So I think apparently initially the TSG, or whatever they're officially known as, basically went in, gave them all a kicking, smashed the place up, and then left, and then the nice police turned up.
Well, I was going to say, you had the Met Police, who are notorious for being really corrupt.
Yeah.
And there's loads of stories about, the people who killed Stephen Lawrence and why they didn't get, prosecuted.
Right.
Because mates of police and gangsters in London and loads of stories like that.
Yeah.
I know loads of stories just from, the Met Police being, don't fuck about with them. So, they are notorious even amongst certain police forces, i.e. they would go in a bit more like, don't fuck about with us. Maybe in London, like I'm saying, in Acton, because I guess the thing, the parties in the countryside, you could often get away with in parties because that was the point. If they're in some sleepy town, there's 4 coppers or whatever, or 2 coppers with a police car driving around the village, and then they suddenly have to mobilise all these police.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you said about the support group because they were, I think,
like
you said, for the miners' strike, they were there to go in and
and really teach people a lesson rather than...
They're there to fucking go and give people a kick in.
And obviously we know about what happened at the Beanfield was a similar sort of paramilitary force. I'm not conflating the two, because I think that the Beanfield was a horrifying kind of event that, really changed people's lives forever. A lot of people, really kind of didn't recover very well, and the travelling scene was very damaged as a result. But what happened at Acton Lane had a similar element to it, as in they had no names, they were riot shields, they were basically there just to give people a pasting. And it was a sign that they were using those sorts of tactics now. And it wasn't going to be, look, turn the music off, this is a health and safety problem. It was going to be, we're just going to steam it and be violent. So I think that event meant that actually when Spiral Tribe were at the Castlemorton event, for example, they had all borrowed sound system. They didn't even have their own stuff because they'd had all their stuff smashed up. Actually, I think the legacy really of the wedge issue that John Major was trying to create was that first of all they tried to just bust Spirals because they had the target on their back, the violence. Then obviously Spirals were there a long time. So some people have said, oh well, you left and you didn't turn the sound system off and all of that kind of thing. And there was maybe an element of that. And also the court injunction actually didn't kick in until the Thursday of Castlemorton. But obviously they arrested and they seemed to pick Spiral's stuff. They all knew who they were. They arrested them. And then they tried to use some really weird laws to kind of make them a precedent to then use against parties moving forwards. But the trial took so long to come to being. In the end, it was about a year and a half. January of 94 that the trial eventually happened, or around then. And the laws they tried to use were so sort of obscure, public nuisance, things that hadn't been used for like 100 years.
Well, certainly, there's all these laws about trespass on common land, that are, like I said, 100, 200 years old, and no one's ever dug them out of the dusty book that they're written in for 200 years.
Were barely ever used, and despite the 2-3 months of the trial being quite touch and go to a certain extent, a lot of people said they really didn't feel confident that they would get acquitted, and there was a few pivot moments in the trial which we covered a little bit in the film with one of the Worcester police guys who was in some ways sort of forced to retire because he was actually not comfortable with saying they started it, because he knew that he'd said, look, just get off the roads and go on the common because at least you're safer there than... He allowed it to happen because he knew that it was a massive traffic issue. Well,
I guess in one way he was doing what they call common sense policing.
Common sense policing.
Which, you could understand it was... That's not the tactical support group. That's like, this is going to happen. Yeah. To be safe, you need to go here and blah blah blah. Yeah,
I've never really been able to uncover the sort of truth because obviously my film had limited resources in terms of journalism that I could really delve into police records and that type of thing. But the tales I've heard at least is that he really kind of had to retire because he'd gone against the grain of the system to a certain extent, and he was quite well. It wasn't very well as a result of his being his own person instead of towing the line. And he was at the trial, and he did give evidence at the hospital, his own hospital bed, to say that he was largely responsible for making the call that it should be there rather than there, and that seemed to be the pivotal bit of evidence, at least, as well as other things like the jury just hearing from them and realising they're just ravers. They're not evil masterminds trying to take over the world. They're just a bunch of ravers who just wanted to have a party, and they're just like anybody else. And I think that meant that the jury were like, well, they don't really, you're going to, what, how many years? So there was a certain common sense element, I think, that also came in. So I guess, the film covers that story, really. It covers the point of which the travellers met, the rave scene at Glastonbury 90, it seems. That 2-year period where it went from, a handful of people in a National Trust car parks, sort of with a decks and a little sound system, which was a combination of local ravers, DIY with the sound system and the decks and the music and travellers who knew about the countryside. And it was that little seed of that idea, which I think had been also tried in other places like, the beach parties with Tonka, like getting a sound system, having it outside, doing it for free, and other sorts of events similar. And that then mushrooming over those 2 years and building up to that huge moment where rave had gone overground to a certain extent. You had SL2 doing kind of, Ragga Tip, and it was like, top 5, whatever it was.
What did you want to show in the film, though? What did you think you wanted to show throughout your film?
I think that the traveller side of the story has been very ignored in the whole rave history, if you like. So there was one element that I always thought was very important to make people realise that this was what it was a combination of the free festival concept that the travellers had.
Because obviously that's
invented.
not a new concept.
No.
Free festivals go back to the late 60s, early 70s.
Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously they go back way beyond, to whatever.
The happenings in San Francisco, and then you go back even further, pagan times, and there's always been an opportunity for local communities to have an event connected to the solstice or the harvest or the... and dance and imbibe in, get drunk on cider.
It's the most natural thing in the world.
On common land usually, common space, done for no monetary gain. Everybody put something in how everybody would bring their services to it. So it's a very old idea, and I think it was a resurgence of that, both in the free festival era, but also with the restrictions of the laws that had been brought in as a result of the Beanfield in '86, the Public Order Act. The ravers, without thinking about it, they found another way, which was, well, if you have a party for free, well, nobody's an organiser, there's no gate, so a pay party legislation can't affect it. And also, we're not residing on here, we're having a party and then we're going.
Well,
so
in a way,
living here.
You can't get more traditional British, can you, than like this? All the people are like moaning, you can't get more the traditional, the fair, the summer fair, or the, like you said, on the common land. It's a natural historical thing that's been going on for thousands of years.
I mean, very, very British, but probably completely across all cultures. We just seem to have held on to it a little bit more than other places, as in, with, like you say, the village fairs, the sort of Celtic clock, Beltane, the Midsummer, all of these things which have been marked by festivals. And in some ways, the free festivals were resurgences of that, let's do this thing at the solstice and the equinox.
Well, Stonehenge, you can't really get more blatant than that's what it is, can you?
Yes, of course. And Stonehenge being seemingly this big astrological clock that's effectively counting down the changes of the time, and that being a place to gather, and whether that was for something. And actually the film that I'm finishing at the moment to put into our virtual premiere, that's built around the traveller, photographer and archivist Alan Tash, Lodge Tash, he's known. He says there's a great comment. He sort of says, we know that these things have been happening for thousands of years, and we don't know if it was for the cosmic reasons or for the agricultural reasons, but we bloody well know it's for the gathering reasons. And that was it.
Do you know what?
That
is ultimately, again, don't matter how cosmic you want to get, but it's something about,
coming together, doing something together, dancing, whatever it is, making sounds, imbibing of substances. It's a very, very, very deep part of us, I think, and in some ways I think it's sort of lost in the commercial world. But there was an attempt, I think, a chaotic attempt at sort of reviving that as a tradition, in this sort of free environment in the countryside, for sure.
He takes some great photos, Alan Lodge, as well.
Beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a few of his, well, they're more like small magazines and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, the zines he's done, yeah.
Yeah, but if you go to his site, I know he does amazing photos from Castlemorton, but just all over.
Oh, yeah.
All the festival sort of stuff. I mean, he's been doing it since day dot, hasn't he, really?
Yeah, I think,
as far as I know.
I think 76, 77, something like that, he got a camera. And his initial reason to get a camera was as sort of some ways to record what the police were doing. Because what he was discovering, he was actually originally an London ambulance man. And he would offer his services as an ambulance man on festivals. You know, I can, rather than taking you to Salisbury General Hospital, maybe I can patch up your broken arm because you got a bit too drunk on cider and you fell off a log.
Fair play to him, man. Yeah. That's not the sort of job I'd want to have, dealing with loads of casualties from the festival.
Absolutely. But you know, and again, he says it in this film that we're going to show at the virtual premiere. He said, you know, you can mop up maybe 80% of the problems that you might have because maybe someone gives birth that weekend. You know, I mean, Stonehenge in the end went on for 7 weeks. You know, I mean, there was a lot of things that are going to happen over that 7 weeks in any part of the world, and you know, maybe they can avoid having to go to the hospital by having a group of people with a few skills. But one of the other things he said was that he got a camera partly because people were increasingly coming to the welfare tent but having been victimised on the way in. And maybe they were on something, but the police gave them a load of bother and it was calming them down. And then he started to record really what the police were doing. So that, and he even built a dark room in the back of his van.
Amazing.
So that he could have an alternative story than the police's story to show. So he could say, look, actually, this is your constable blah blah with a truncheon over this young person's head.
Well, do you know what? We all know now with people with mobile phones, the good and bad things of mobile phones, partly the good thing about them is that people can record what actually happened.
Yeah,
and obviously we've seen with loads of events worldwide that it's changing certain narratives because you can actually see that, you know, we used to be able to, with the policeman never lies, so they'd believe him in court. But obviously if you've got a video proving that the opposite, you know.
And I think Tash was a pioneer of that in a way. Of course, now we're in a situation that everyone gets their news from different places, so we're in a whole other post-truth problem.
Well, yeah, and with AI, like
is it real anyway?
With that's a whole, but
so he would do that, and then he basically then started to just document the lifestyle and went right up through.
Incredible.
And he was one of the only photographers, certainly independent photographers, to get photography of what the police did at the Beanfield, which is a horrible but very important.
Well, because a lot of the original footage went missing, didn't it?
Yes, although we don't quite know for sure, because now I have seen all the tapes that are available, and there's a fair bit of it.
Okay.
And a lot of it's pretty gruesome. So I'm not, if they did cut some stuff out, they left quite a lot of gruesome stuff in there too.
Maybe that is a myth then, because, you know.
It's something that has never been proven either way, but it was something that one of the journalists at the time thought had happened, that he thought his cameraman had captured some other things that he didn't see when he went back to Kim Sabido, when he went back to the
he was
TV
the ITN
studio.
reporter, wasn't he? You know, that's the classic clip.
And his cameraman was the only video camera in the field. Yeah. So very, very dark stuff, really, when you think about it. But yes, so the film really was, I suppose, charting that story of this meeting point between these cultures and the explosion of that event, and then the increasing draconian laws that have been brought in to curtail free gathering.
Well, it's like social history, isn't it? It's social history.
I think so. I think some people, it's often been put into music documentary categories when we've showed it at festivals, but I think it's not really that, because I think music documentaries are usually about the artists in some way, or the genre at least, and this isn't really about the genre. Music is the spine of the story just through music, but we never sit there and talk about, this track was made with this drum machine and all of that kind of thing, which I love a lot of that stuff.
Well, exactly. I'm a geek for that sort of stuff as well, and I can watch someone talk for hours about that sort of stuff. But again, on this podcast, we never really break down tracks or do that sort of stuff. It's just that's the soundtrack to it.
Yeah.
I know, like, the soundtrack that you've got, though, for the film is incredible. I know for you, maybe it was too good. You were too bloody good. Because I know you've had a lot of issues. I mean, I will say as well, because, and we will talk about the fundraiser you got coming up, but this is not an official release for your film. It's still kind of it's a finished film, but it's not 100% finished, is it?
Yeah, so I mean, a way the traditional way of making a film, maybe 5-10 years ago, was you come up with an idea, you pitch it to a big broadcaster, they then give you some money to go off and maybe do a little test case. You come back with what would be called a taster. They then greenlight it or can it. They give you some more money, and then you go out and make it. And with that budget that you've got to pay for the stuff you need. And then at the end of that, that's theirs to show in whatever capacity. And that would be the same, maybe right up to the end of the 2010s, pretty much. That's how documentaries certainly got made. There was definitely a few independent films, and sometimes things would be made between different sort of co-funded organisations. So maybe Arte over here and Canal Plus would give some money to a film.
There's some films, you watch the intro to the film and you've got about 2 minutes of all these cards coming out.
Different logos.
As a punter, I always hate that bit. I'm like, where's the bloody film going to start? It's in association with so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so chewing gum, so-and-so milk float, blah, blah, blah.
Well, there's none of that on my film, funnily enough.
Well,
because we didn't get any money from anybody apart from we had to crowdfund it, because we tried the traditional routes, and in a way the timing of bringing my film out was slightly challenging, because the idea would be something that a traditional broadcaster might well have gone for, with some caveats. So maybe, 10 years ago, something like the BBC or Channel 4 might have been interested in it. But increasingly, they've had their wings clipped to the types of films that they're allowed to make. They've increasingly had to think commercially. And then the streamers have come along. And initially, the streamers were a fabulous boost to documentary, because they were so keen to get people's eyes and subscriptions that they invested a lot into a lot of films, and it was called the golden age of documentary.
Yeah, no, exactly.
But it didn't last. It didn't last for a couple of reasons. First of all, during the pandemic, they'd saved up a lot of content. They'd made a lot of stuff, and then they also had algorithmic data, which was 10 years worth of people doing streaming. Well, what are they watching? Well, here's the top 10 of what they're watching. Well, let's just totally ignore the bottom 5 things.
Yeah.
And we're only going to concentrate on those 5. And then we're going to make sure those 5 are algorithmically perfect, as in, if it's factual-based stuff, it's true crime, which is a big selling point, because it's kind of, some of them are great, but some of them are just basically gossip.
Yeah.
Celebrity, well, we know that wins, because it's already got an audience. Sport, it's already got an audience. We know that wins. Beneath that, reality shows. Everything underneath that, counterculture, subculture, music even, unless it's very big celebrities, we're just going to ignore. So we tried the traditional routes. I did start from a completely no-budget start, and like I said, I wanted to make the film about the Roundhouse, because I thought I could do that. I make all sorts of little films and do edit work and stuff for a living.
Well, again, the sound kept cutting off, so that saved you money on the budget for the soundtrack.
That's true.
It's a classic shot.
Yeah. But I also knew that the Roundhouse almost had zero footage of it, and so what the hell was I even thinking, And I did think at one point of making a radio thing, I'd do a radio thing about the Roundhouse. But once I started doing, I just thought I'd start, I've got cameras, I'll start interviewing people. While I thought, first of all, get a little taster film together, and I'll just, nick some bits from YouTube, and I'll do what I can. I'll pitch that to some people. So that's what I did. I did some interviews with people I made contact with, and a handful, maybe 10 or so. I just went and did interviews. I realised I wanted to do more than just the story about the Roundhouse, the whole Castlemorton thing, the Travellers, the Criminal Justice Act. It felt just so rich, and I was sort of amazed nobody had done it before. You know, I was like, somebody must have done it, and I kept looking, and I found 2 minutes in this film, and Jeremy Deller's film came out, and it mentions sort of a little bit about it, and there was something in a program called Festivals Britannica, which again, each time I saw it, it was like, oh, that's really interesting. But they always say the same. They always seemed not Jeremy's film at all, but they always painted the Travellers in a very negative light.
Yeah, I mean,
and it was always like, oh, and then Castlemorton came along and it ruined everything.
But you know what? This is partly what I try and do for this podcast on certain bits, because there always seems to, for most things, there's like some stereotypical narrative that people. Yeah. And again, for my sins, I go on TikTok and stuff like that. I mean, you see people talking about the rave stuff. They pull out the same cliches.
Yeah.
And not go beyond that.
I think this is it, and I was really, the more I interview people, and it was a slow process, but through those couple of years before the pandemic, I was kind of building the archive and interviewing people. What I realised was that particularly the traveller side of the story was really underrepresented or misrepresented, and as soon as you meet people, you realise they're just like you and me, and their story is fascinating and interesting, and obviously you know that from being a podcast creator, and you start delving into stories and you think, wow, all of that world that people don't know about, and so and I did have a bit of mistrust from people. A few people were like, who are you? Who do you think you are? Wanting to tell a story about this. A few people literally said, don't make this film.
Really?
Like, yeah.
Why are they saying that?
I think because they thought, again, I would misrepresent it. I would come from the wrong angle.
You should show them a picture of your hippie mum.
Yeah, I mean, looking at me, I don't look like I've had a particularly countercultural life, but I sure have.
Yeah.
Although, I've worked in the mainstream too. I've done films in the mainstream in a lot of ways, and so yeah. I mean, I knew it was an amazing story.
Yeah.
I just knew it was an amazing story, and
It is an amazing story. Yeah.
I felt like I was in a good position to do it because I have got one foot in the mainstream. I can make films, but I loved these stories that were countercultural stories that were about things people hadn't heard or perspectives they hadn't heard. Not all of it shiny and lovely, there was some dark elements too. But I kind of felt like I could just see it as an arc, as a, they call it the 3-act or the 5-act story, don't they? And I could just see it as a story there, and with Castlemorton in the middle, and the Criminal Justice Act at Act 4, and it just felt like a very perfect story to tell.
It is a great story, but I know one of your... I mean, so you've been kind of doing it almost in a DIY sort of fashion.
Yeah.
You haven't been able to release it as in... put it out in cinemas. I don't know what's the correct word, but
so what I've discovered through my naivety is that I just started and I kind of kept doing the next bit and the next bit and the next bit, and the first bit was I'll make this trailer and I'll put it out to people who might fund it. Nobody wanted to fund it, but someone leaked it.
Oh right.
And I think it was something like December 2019. Someone leaked the trailer and it was on. Someone posted it on YouTube. I don't know who it is to this day.
Yeah.
Someone posted it on YouTube and 20,000 people watched it in a day, and this was, I remember walking around an exhibition with my 2 daughters at the time, and I was bling 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 bling, and I was like, what the hell? And there were, thousands of people suddenly going, when's it out? And I was like, it's just a taster film at this stage. I just literally made this proof of concept type idea, and that gave me a real kick up the arse to kind of both do one thing, which was to create a little community around it. So rather than it just be a sort of random thing, it was a Facebook group that was set up just before that or started to develop, but also realise you've got to be quite careful with things like music rights and archive, because I've just, a lot of this footage had just been found, And I had spoken to a few people about their footage, but it was time to me to sort things out a little bit. So obviously that was I had to go make a load of calls. I'm really sorry. I don't know who posted this thing. I'm sorry your 5-second clip that was on YouTube was on there. It was it was a mistake. Somebody leaked it.
Were people upset about it?
A few people were upset, but thankfully most of those have since become really valuable contributors to the film, and thanks to all of those people. But after that, a few things happened because I decided to take it a bit more seriously and to really try to get it made. I pitched it to the BFI, I pitched it to all of these traditional places and got knockbacks. Increasingly positive knockbacks, but knockbacks nonetheless. And then lockdown kicked in. And when lockdown kicked in, I had sort of had the community start to kind of share footage and stories and stills, and I got to know a little bit more about.
Because I will say that the footage that you have in it is incredible.
It is,
you know, I mean, yeah.
And I mean, I wouldn't have that if it wasn't for a handful of people who back then had a camera, both in terms of stills, people like Tash and others who have kind of recorded that whole story, or a lot of those stories, or their sides to the stories, and then a few people who had video cameras. And I was talking to them last night about their contribution. Fabulous, so thankful that they did. And of course, it was a lot of this stuff had been sat on a shelf for a long time, never been captured. So lockdown gave me an opportunity to really get into the archive and to talk to people and to share. And I did a lot of like radio type interviews over Zoom, beefing up the story. And then once lockdown had opened up again, I did a few more interviews, and then we launched a Kickstarter campaign, and we did fabulously on the Kickstarter campaign. It wasn't enough by any stretch of the imagination to finish a film, but it gave us a good start. And it meant that we then, about a year later, showed a work in progress version. So you're basically going, we're not done, but here it is. And it was about 2 hours and 10 minutes there. And I was literally on the way down to Bristol where we showed it at Lost Horizon, still putting the reels together on the train.
Wow.
Before I arrived, and I hadn't slept for about 3 weeks, and I was a nervous wreck because I was convinced I would show it and everyone would hate it and everyone would think I'd done a terrible job. But we put on this event, and we also got a bit of funding from the Arts Council to do an exhibition. Because what I really wanted it to be was more than just, here's the film. I wanted it to be, it was the 30th anniversary of Castlemorton. And I wanted it to be a way for other people to tell their stories as well. So there was a lot of the contributors to the film, both in terms of interviews, shared their photos or their diaries or some of their film elements, and we had it as an exhibition, and we got a bit of money from the Arts Council for that, and that was such a brilliant event. I mean, I was broken when I screened it, and I just stood at the fire exit at the back with my head in my hands,
ready to run,
do a runner. I was seriously ready to do a runner. I was thinking, if I'll just try and see if I'll order a cab. And I was sat there just bricking it, thinking everyone was going to hate me, because I'd had 3 weeks of no sleep trying to finish it.
There's partly that, but also, I understand you. Yeah, I mean,
you don't know how people are going to react.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're talking about illegal free parties and.
Yeah. And it was also a very precious time in people's lives.
Yeah.
So I was very, very keen not to misrepresent them. And but thankfully, almost nobody said, you made me look like da da da. A few people said, oh, you made it that bit funny and whatever. But generally, everybody was extremely positive about it, and it was
well, you're talking about some
relief.
Subcultures have been quite demonised in lots of other ways.
Yeah.
And like I said, sometimes the almost the same old cliches can be just as bad as almost portraying everyone as the devil, if you know what I mean. Just
yeah. And I know there are certain things I haven't managed to cover, because in the end, a film is only a certain length.
There's only so much you can do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
so that gave me, in a way, doing that work in progress screening, which we was free, and we did a number of free screenings over the following years. I'd kind of iterate the film a little bit, do a little bit more work on it, but we had no real funding, and I tried again to pitch for money and didn't get any money. So for the following year, really, we just worked on these work in progress screenings. Sometimes there'd be a bit of donations or something like that, but generally it was, and we set up a PayPal, and people would bung me 20 quid sometimes. I'd be like, thank you so much, make such a difference, that, you know, Penny and the Jenny kind of attitude.
No,
you
well,
know?
it helps, yeah.
It just, I mean, all of it, even if it just kept me ticking over. And then we had an opportunity, and I didn't quite know how I was going to make it work, because film festivals tend to run from the autumn all the way through to the following sort of summer, and then the summer festivals generally take over. And I knew that there was a really cool music doc fest called Dock and Roll, based in the UK, who we'd got to know, and they were really supportive, and we chatted to them a lot, and they were really keen to have the film, but we had no way of funding both the archive for a film festival license or the music. And I was just stumped. I was just like, well, I need a massive wedge of money to do it, even for a film festival screening.
Well, this is what I mean about you almost too good with your choice of soundtrack, because like, and like maybe you did need someone as well, but I'm not saying you had to cut stuff out, but because all this music and a lot of it's some barely underground artists, but they're all owned by these big conglomerates.
Yeah,
it's not an easy word for me to say.
It's a hard one to say, isn't it? I mean, you're right, is that a lot of the time, when I made direct contact with the artists, they'd go, sounds wicked. And they would just say, no problem, straight away.
Well, you said Aphex was fine, didn't you? You said he was fine.
He was amazing, actually. And a lot of other artists were good. And even some artists that ended up, I did have to cut out, but some of the major label publishers were extremely stuck on a rigid system. And so sadly, because I didn't quite know how I was going to get the money to do the film festival run, because I still got to clear it, even if that's just a piece of paper saying we're giving it to you gratis for the film festivals for 1 year, I still needed that piece of paper before I could sign the contract with a film festival to say, yes, we've cleared the music, because they don't want to get in trouble, because they're going to put the film all over the country. So I had this terrifying 6-7 weeks of, and I got a amazingly helpful music supervision team who did it for free. So massive thanks to them, Hannah and Dan, who...
How'd you sort that one out?
They basically, with me, we worked through the whole list, and we kind of cut the ones out that we just knew were not going to happen.
Well, big respects to Hannah and Dan.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And then thankfully, 2 people came in with some money who basically said, we just want to see your film out there. And I agreed to them. I said, look, if ever we get to the money making bit, I'll draw up a contract and say you get a percentage, because you're making this happen right now.
Yeah.
And at one point we had quite a lot of people interested in investing, actually, because it was still of that era where potentially we could have got on Netflix. And at that point I was having conversations with quite a lot of big production companies who were all very positively saying we can sell this or we can get this out. So at that point, it still felt like the festival. I felt like we'll get it to the festivals, and then we'll get it on a big streamer, and it'll be be great. But since then, what I've realised is things have changed quite radically in the film industry, and particularly documentaries. So anyway, we did have this bit of money come in, which was a real lifesaver. Again, people who really wanted to make it happen. That paid for the licenses largely for the film festivals, and then we did an 18-month film festival run, which was amazing. Maybe not quite 18 months, 14, 16 months. And that started with Dock and Roll. We did something like 30 sellout screenings all over the country, and it was incredible. And I went to loads of the Q&As and the responses from old people, young people, brilliant, incredible responses. And I kind of knew that both the soundtrack was great and the story was really resonating with people.
I mean, to me, it's still shocking that you don't think someone would be really wanting to push this out, because it's such a story, and it's some underground subcultures.
And I think, like I say, not that long ago, there'd be it would have got on those places. But because of this, because the streamers have become very powerful, because the likes of the BBC has been sort of hollowed out and they're having to play the game, I think the Tories really killed the BBC, and it's not quite recovered, or maybe it won't recover, who knows, fingers crossed. I still think it's a very valuable resource for us all, and good value actually in a way, But their remit's definitely changed, and where is our home for it? So We've kept going through the film festivals. Small bits of money have come in through festival screenings, and then we could claim back a little bit of money from the government because it's an independent British film, thankfully. And that has now paid for this licenses for a virtual premiere. So we're launching the virtual premiere on the 30th of May, and it will run for the weekend to the 2nd of June. And the idea of that was hopefully it's a success. We hope so. People are going to be able to stream the film. There'll be one night which will have a whole series of films as well as the film itself. So the film will be at 7 o'clock, and then we'll have this film that I've done with Alan Lodge, and a film I've made with Jeremy Deller, like a chat a little bit like this. And then these Q&As and some additional footage. So it's a whole night's worth of stuff, and then people can do it on demand the rest of the weekend. And we're hopeful that what that does is basically give us all the last licenses we need to be able to go, again, totally DIY, totally independently, to the major platforms, which at the moment we can't do because of a bunch of, licensing restrictions. So we're closer than ever. And hopefully this is the second to last step, I suppose, of getting it out there fully. As in, if this goes well, then we can potentially go to these platforms. Not to be acquired, because that was the old way, that they would come and we would buy your film. But for us to effectively, a little bit like how amateurs get their film, their music on Spotify, you can technically get your stuff up on some of these platforms using something called an aggregator. And then you've got to do all the marketing yourself. You've got to tell everybody that it's there to go and watch it. So fingers crossed. I mean, we're 6.5, 7 years later.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that it's got as far as it has in a way. So whenever I kind of get very depressed about it and,
I mean, I know it's been a hard old slog for you. I know you said you started doing it, and probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe you wouldn't have started if you'd known all the, but they say ignorance is bliss, or but again, that's
naive.
What?
Hugely naive, massively naive.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, I know you would have learnt quite a bit from doing it, which is obviously, I hope you learned from doing it.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
But you've done amazing so far.
Yeah, and I mean, what's great is that we're able to do screenings like the screening you came to the other day, a brilliant little kind of anarchist archive library, and there was maybe 40 people there or something, and we can do things like that. And then the following night at the Deptford and New Cross Free Film Festival at a kind of in a sort of squatted community space. So we're still doing things like that are just brilliant, that people can come, that are very different audiences to maybe the more traditional cinema type film festival audiences. We're also screening at a music festival in a couple of weeks, at something called Bearded Theory, where we're still getting it out to different sorts of audience. We've gone all over Europe as well. I mean, and this has blown my mind. The first screening we did abroad, I thought, they're not going to know what a New Age traveller is. They're not going to. Are they going to care what the squatting and rave scene was like in the UK? But I guess because it went on to be so influential around the world, and obviously the rave story itself is so thought about around the world.
Well, this is what I mean about the UK. It's like what we are good at, you know, is, for all our good and bad about the UK, the one thing I am patriotic about is we're good at creating fucking weird music, weird genres of music, putting stuff together,
youth culture,
youth culture is UK, we're brilliant at that.
Yeah.
And that is something that should be massively supported.
Yeah, and for sure. And of course, generally we're quite good at taking something from an original source like America, Chicago, Detroit as the musical form and going, wow, look at this. Well, let's turn it into these huge, great big events in the countryside, which clearly Kevin Sanderson, Derek May, all those people weren't thinking that
they
that
didn't
was
think
happening.
That, and obviously, and with respect to them,
total respect to them.
No, but with respect to them, I was going to say that when they come over to the UK in '87, like they were like, fucking hell, they weren't playing to hardly anyone in the, there were small places in Detroit. The music was influential, but I know, people like Derek May come over and suddenly like, fucking hell, they realise. these crazy
massive
punters are just dancing
and
mental to their tunes.
Absolutely. So it is something we've done really well, and the rest of the world does seem quite keen to know that story. I suppose it's an origin story, because obviously the latter half of the film we talk a little bit how a lot of the sound systems after the criminal justice bill went out to Europe. That was the seeds of what are now huge scenes that are out there, the Technival scene, the kind of travelling kind of sound system scenes in, Italy, in Portugal particularly, huge in France, massive in France, Czech, but also they've touched into a lot of the sort of large sort of squats in places like Holland and certainly Italy as well, and the film is also screened in West and East Coast in America and Australia. So it's been, even if it had to stop today, which I hope obviously it doesn't. No. But it's had an amazing life really for something that was done in an entirely DIY way, with of course I've driven it forwards, but so many people have helped me along the way, and I mean the huge amount of support that it's had has come from people just really wanting the story to come to life, both financially, yes, but also just in terms of research. I was quite lucky because I had Harry from DIY writing his book Dreaming in Yellow a similar time, and Mark from Spiral Tribe writing his book A Darker Electricity. So I had kind of two brothers in arms, both kind of figuring out the
we haven't talked much about story. DIY, but obviously they're a key part of the story as well. The plan for the next year or so then is to do this fundraiser that you got coming up, and then
do the fundraiser. Hopefully it goes well. We've got, I'm not sure where the podcast will be released, but the film will be out on the 30th of May. If that goes well and we have got a bit of daylight with the finances that we need, hopefully we can sort out all of our last licensing challenges, of which there's still a few, and then have a nice summer. We've got a brilliant screening lined up at the South Bank Centre, which is amazing to me as well. Yeah. Purcell Rooms on August the 9th, a big traditional entity like that, sharing a story like this. And I checked actually this morning, and we're about, whatever we are, 3 months away, and I think they've sold half the seats already.
Amazing. Obviously, people will watch this at all different times. Yeah. So is there a good place to see where the latest showing will be? On your Instagram, or is there a website or stuff like that?
Yeah, so the website is the best place. I've kind of made it the sort of, somewhat functional now. So freepartydoc.info is the website, and the virtual premiere will be launched there. But then after that, any screenings we're doing in person will also be there. And if, fingers crossed, the virtual premiere goes well, obviously I really hope it does, then information about where we eventually will have it streaming, if we do manage to get it onto all these platforms, will obviously also be on there as well. So, there's press stuff and interviews, links and that kind of thing. So when you release this, I'll obviously link.
No, sure. I'll put the links underneath. Right. What's your plans post this, Aaron? Or you're not thinking that far ahead? Well, I think Free Party 2, the sequel. When's that happening?
Well, it's funny because I've been sharing it with quite a few places that have had younger crews actually come along, younger people, and you never quite know. Maybe they just think this is a bunch of thing about a bunch of old kind of dads and mums talking about how great things were in the old days.
Oh, in one way it is. Yeah. One way it is. Yeah. They are all dads and mums now. Yeah. But funny enough, I have a lot of students, they always go on about that, when I was teaching for a long time, they'd always go on about the early 90s. Oh, Neil, you were out. They're misty-eyed. And I'd be like, well,
Well, I think it's the equivalent of us in the late 80s, early 90s, watching Woodstock. Exactly. And thinking about, the Who live at Leeds and Hendrix playing the Roundhouse and all of that.
I was more looking back to the punk stuff. Yeah.
or
exactly.
The punk.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think generations will glean things from the past.
And as I always say, there's still loads of parties going on now. Yeah. It's not like just a nostalgia fest, but it's an important story to tell from that time, I guess is the key point. Yeah, it's not just, it was better back then.
I don't think so. And I mean, all these young people that have been coming to see the film have been really responding by saying, this is really inspiring, but we're still doing it.
Exactly.
And they're showing me their little groups of going, oh, look, here's the thing that we did. And they look massive. And I'm
but they are. I know parties are going on. Yeah, exactly. And this is the whole fucking point. Like that, they were saying it's been going on forever. And even, we didn't dig too much in the criminal justice bill bit, but like, even that bit, they stopped certain bits of it, but fucking hell, they didn't stop everything. And there's almost a bit now where there's still loads of parties going on, and there's still be like some mad bits in the countryside. Yeah. If 50,000 people turn up, like supposedly Castlemorton or whatever, then that will cause an issue. But
I think what I gather is that, again, because obviously new laws have just been introduced 2 or 3 years ago by the outgoing Tory government, and the current Labour government doesn't seem in any rush to repeal them. But the laws that were brought in are, in some ways making it extremely expensive for sound systems to exist in the way that they might have done back then. And also, obviously, they're focused on protest and environmental groups and Black Lives Matter and all of these various entities that now they can kind of make up whatever reason they want to arrest somebody if they don't like them. I mean, this is what it is become now. Yeah. So the laws, when we do mention this at the end of the film, the laws are now very, very hard, and they are so draconian, and the idea of common space is dwindling enormously in the world. And I was at a talk recently and they said, 8% of the land of England is available to the people. The rest is private or off limits and is owned by 1%. So I think it's that disparity, that kind of disconnection between nature and people's access to nature is an ongoing massive problem. But young people are quite smart and they kind of find a way because, in the end, what are young people going to do? Well, they're going to, particularly at the moment with everything being so expensive, they don't have access to festivals or clubs because they're either going out of business or they're too expensive. And so what do? They'll find another way round, and they'll probably use their urge to meet to find smart ways around the law.
It will never stop. It will never stop.
No.
All right, shall we finish there? Or we could have gone on for a lot longer.
Yeah.
But as usual, I've sort of probably taken you around the houses and diverted.
No, it's great.
But I guess what I'd say just to finish is, I know you're doing this like a crazy man. You've been doing it for like 6-7 years. And a lot of times you're doing it, you're not getting loads of money because you're doing like free screenings.
Yeah.
And so anyone who thinks, like you said, you were worried about the reaction. They're like, this guy is, he's becoming a millionaire off the free party and the rave scene. There's nothing further from the truth. But you've been fighting to get this out. You've been like touring the bloody world, doing your screenings. So what I say is, any way that anyone is watching this, whenever you're watching it, go to the website. I'll put the link below. Support, pay your money for maybe a screening or a poster or whatever, whatever else, merch or whatever other ways. The money is going to get the film out there. It's a story that needs to be told. All right? And it will never fucking stop. These parties, it never will stop.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I know that on the outside people just go, why hasn't he released it? Why isn't he giving it away for free? I mean, a tiny minority of people do that.
Oh, mate.
But they don't realise
What you need to do is put a big screen up on like Castlemorton Common. Show it for free. Go, everyone can come.
Yeah.
Get on the news. Get on the Daily Mail. Get on the Sun and the Telegraph and all the fucking.
Well, watch this space. That idea has been floated.
All right. There we go.
We'll see though.
All right.
Nice one.
Nice one speaking today.
Cheers, man. Appreciate it. It was really fun. That was great.